There is a beam above every old house that carries the entire weight of the roof, worn smooth by generations who never once looked up to ask if it was tired. Picture an old wooden house at night, deep in a valley, where the wind has quieted, and the family sleeps beneath a roof that has never once fallen, held steady by a single beam no one has thought to examine in years. Dust settling softly into its grain, while the whole house breathes slowly around it, unaware of what it rests on. If you have spent your life being the one others lean on, the steady one, the one who never seems to need holding yourself, you already know what it is to carry something for so long that you forget you are carrying it at all. You have learned to stand very still, very straight, and to call that peace. Tonight, let yourself simply listen. There is nothing here you need to fix, solve, or hold together for anyone. Nothing waiting on the other side of this that requires your strength. You are allowed, just once, to be the one who is cared for instead of the one doing the caring. I want to say something honestly. Before we begin, I did not write tonight's stories as someone standing outside this feeling. I wrote them as someone who also forgets, most days, that tiredness is allowed to be spoken out loud. That strength was never supposed to mean carrying everything alone. If part of you resists softening tonight, that resistance is welcome here too. It does not need to leave before you are allowed to rest. Tonight holds 10 complete stories, drawn from Chan monasteries in old China, quiet Zen halls in Kamakura, Japan, and the Seon temples of Goryeo, Korea, alongside the ordinary, unrecorded lives, history never bothered to name, the potters and ferrymen and village healers who carried just as much and were remembered by no one. Some knots need only one story to loosen. Others need two, laid side by side, before the weight finally shifts and something in you is quietly permitted to set itself down. These stories are contemplative in nature and are not a substitute for medical or therapeutic care. Let your shoulders drop from wherever they have been holding on without your permission. Let the mattress take more of your weight than you usually allow it to. There is nowhere else you are needed right now, and nothing else you must carry until morning. Just this. Just the low, steady sound of the first story beginning, somewhere above you, in an old wooden house, in the dark, where a beam has been waiting a very long time to be asked how it is doing. Somewhere in that house, beneath the beam that had held its roof for longer than anyone could remember, a small lamp had just been lit. And in its narrow circle of light, another story was waiting to begin. One about a girl who learned so early how to become the kind of person a whole household could lean its weight against, that the learning never once felt like a choice. She did not remember deciding it. She only remembered a grey morning, many years ago, when someone needed her hands to be steady, and so her hands became steady, and simply stayed that way, the way water stays the shape of whatever it is poured into, without ever being asked if it minded the shape. There is a particular quality to lying awake while everyone else in the house sleeps soundly, trusting, without ever having to think about it, that morning will arrive already handled. The kettle filled, the door checked twice, the small emergencies quietly managed before anyone else even noticed there had been an emergency at all. It is its own kind of loneliness, being the only one awake to the fact that things do not manage themselves. Somewhere in a childhood long past, a decision was made, quietly, without ceremony, without anyone sitting down to ask whether it was wanted. This one would be the one who did not fall apart. Not because it was announced, more because someone had to be, and this person happened to be standing closest when the need appeared. And standing closest has a way of becoming a permanent address, one that no one ever formally assigns and no one ever formally revokes. The years pass. The proof accumulates. Every difficulty survived becomes further evidence for the quiet theory that survival is simply what this person does. Automatically. The way breathing is automatic. Until even they stop remembering there was ever a version of themselves who had not yet been asked to hold anything at all. They forget, too, that a person can be tired in ways that do not show, ways that leave no mark for anyone else to notice or worry over, which is, in its own way, the most exhausting kind of tired there is. The Buddha taught that what we call the self is not a fixed thing but something assembled, moment after moment, out of habit and memory and repetition, so thoroughly assembled over enough years that the assembling disappears from view entirely, and a person comes to believe they were always, essentially, this one steady shape, rather than something that became steady out of necessity and simply never unclenched again. Long ago, in a market town in Heidong, in China, in the 8th century, a blacksmith's daughter discovered this, the way such things are usually discovered. Not through study, and not through any teaching delivered on purpose. Through the quiet shock of being seen, plainly and without flattery, by a stranger who had no reason to lie to her and even less reason to care. The sound arrived first, the way it always did, in layers. Furthest away, the faint clang of another smith's hammer 3 streets over, arriving soft and delayed through the thick summer air. Nearer, the creak of a cart's wooden wheels on the packed road outside, and a farmer's low voice calling to his ox. And nearest of all, close enough to feel in her teeth, the hiss of water meeting hot iron in the trough beside her. A sound her body answered before her mind had finished hearing it. Her name was Mai, and she was 19, and she had been running her family's forge, in practice if not in name, since she was 9 years old. She had never once asked herself what her hands would do with an afternoon that belonged to no one. The question had simply never found room to form, crowded out the way a seedling is crowded by an older, the faster tree that took all the light first. Then one particular afternoon, a stranger asked the question for her, and she discovered, with something close to alarm, that she did not have an answer ready. Her father had been a broad, easy-laughing man before the accident, the kind of smith who sang while he worked and taught his daughter the names of every tool, before she was tall enough to lift most of them. Then a length of scaffolding gave way one winter, and his right shoulder never fully healed, and something in him that had been easy and singing went quiet along with it. Her mother took in mending to help with the coin, and could often be found in the doorway with a needle catching the last of the daylight, glancing up every few minutes to make sure the forge fire had not gone untended. May took the hammer. No one held a family meeting about it. It simply happened. The way water finds the lowest point in a room without needing to be told which way is down. By the time she was 12, the customers had stopped being surprised to see a girl at the anvil and had started, instead, to rely on it. They would call out their orders and their small complaints the way they might to any smith who had earned their trust, never once wondering whether the smith underneath the trust was tired, because she never gave them any reason to wonder. This, too, had become part of the shape she had assembled without meaning to. A face that gave nothing away. Hands that never trembled where anyone could see them. The rain had come suddenly that day, the way it did in the 7th month, turning the road to soft red mud within minutes and driving the market crowd into doorways and under awnings. A traveling monk, robes darkened with water, ducked beneath the forge's wide eave for shelter, and Mai, without breaking the rhythm of her work, moved a stool toward him with her foot and kept hammering, the way she greeted every stranger who passed through. With usefulness instead of conversation. He watched her for a long while before he spoke. "You move like someone who has never once been the youngest person in a room," he said. May did not look up. "I am the eldest in my family. My father was hurt when I was small. Someone had to keep the forge lit. I did not ask what you are to your family," the monk said. "I asked how you move. There is a difference between a hand that chooses its work and a hand that has simply never been asked what else it might do." She set the hammer down, more sharply than she meant to. "The forge does not run itself. If my hands stop, the orders stop. And if the orders stop, my mother worries. And if my mother worries, my father, who still cannot lift his right arm above his shoulder, blames himself for another hard winter. My hands do not have the luxury of asking questions. And when did you last let them try? There has never been a good time." "There will never be a good time," the monk agreed, not unkindly. "That is exactly why it never happens." The words sat in the space between the hammering and the rain, and May found, to her own quiet surprise, that she could not answer them. She realized she was still gripping the hammer, though there was nothing left on the anvil to strike. The monk did not press her further. He only looked up, past her shoulder, at the old beam running the length of the forge roof, blackened with decades of smoke, holding the whole structure steady against the storm outside. "That beam has held this roof through 11 winters that I know of, since before you were born, from what your neighbors tell me," he said. "Not once, in any monastery I have stayed in, has a beam also been asked to sweep the floor beneath it, or tend the fire, or worry about the family sleeping under its protection. It is only ever asked to hold. You have been asked to do both, every day, since you were 9 years old. And you have never once put the second part down long enough to notice you were doing it at all." May opened her mouth to argue and found she had nothing ready. It was the strangest sensation, standing in her own forge, holding her own hammer, and discovering she could not immediately explain why she could not simply sit for a while and let the rain pass without also planning the next 3 tasks behind it. He asked her to try anyway. Just to sit. Just for the length of the rain. Nothing more. She sat. And it was, unexpectedly, one of the hardest things she had done in 10 years. Her hands kept reaching for things that were not there, smoothing her apron, checking the angle of the tongs, straightening tools that did not need straightening. Her mind kept assembling lists of what needed doing the moment the rain stopped. Twice, she nearly stood up on instinct alone, her body rising before her mind had even finished deciding. By the 3rd time, she caught herself halfway to her feet. She understood, with a quiet and almost embarrassed clarity, that she did not actually know how to be a person who was not useful to someone. The knowing did not arrive as an idea. It arrived as an ache low in her chest, The ache of a muscle discovering, after 10 years of being clenched, that it had genuinely forgotten how to be anything else. The rain thinned to a drizzle and then stopped. The monk rose, thanked her for the shelter, and continued on his way without another word about beams or hands or hammers, as if he had already said everything that needed saying and trusted the rest to find its own time, in her own body, at her own pace. That evening, for the first time she could remember, May banked the forge fire a full quarter hour before she needed to. She did not tell her mother why. She simply stood in the doorway a moment longer than usual, watching the last orange light die slowly down in the coals, and let herself wonder, just once, what it might feel like to be asked to hold nothing at all, not even for an afternoon, but for a whole night that was allowed to be entirely, uselessly her own. She did not have an answer yet, but for the first time in 10 years, she let the question stay standing in the room instead of sweeping it out with everything else. Above her, in the last orange light, the old beam sat exactly where it always sat, holding exactly what it always held, asking nothing of the room beneath it and receiving, in return, nothing but weight. It had never once been thanked. It had never once complained. It simply held, the way she had simply held, for longer than either of them had been asked whether holding was something they had wanted to become so good at. It is worth sitting with what May was actually carrying, because it was never really the forge. The forge was only the shape her carrying happened to take. What she was holding, underneath the hammer, and the coal dust and the hiss of water on hot iron, was the belief, formed so early it never even felt like a belief, that her worth and her usefulness had become the same object, fused so completely that setting one down felt indistinguishable from losing the other entirely. This is a familiar mechanism in the Buddhist understanding of suffering. Not the suffering of losing something outright, but the quieter suffering of over-identifying with a role until the role and the self become impossible to tell apart, so that rest itself starts to feel like a small betrayal of who you are, rather than simply something a tired body needs the way it needs water or sleep. The mind grips the function. The function slowly becomes the identity. The identity forgets, eventually, that it was ever assembled at all, piece by piece, out of necessity rather than nature. Perhaps you know this particular ache. Perhaps it shows up on an ordinary evening, finishing some small task no one actually asked you to take on, when a quiet, tired voice inside you finally asks, the way the monk asked May, "When did you last let your hands try something else?" Not a crisis, not a collapse, just a small, overdue question, arriving late, the way most important questions do, long after it would have been convenient to hear it. A hand that has simply never been asked. That line stays, doesn't it? Not because it condemns anyone for their steadiness, but because it notices, gently, that steadiness was never supposed to be the whole of a person. Think of the last time you finished a long day and, instead of resting, found yourself already reaching for the next small task, wiping down a counter that did not need wiping, checking a lock that was already locked, simply because stopping felt less familiar than continuing. That is not laziness asking to be indulged. That is a body that has forgotten, the way May's hands forgot, what it feels like to be trusted with nothing to do. Not asked, not chosen, simply the closest hand when the need appeared. Let your hands rest now, wherever they are, open, if they can be, unclenched from whatever they have been quietly holding all day without your permission. There is nothing for them to reach for right now. Nothing waiting on the other side of this breath that requires them to be useful to anyone. Just this slow inhale, filling you gently from the belly upward, and this slower exhale, releasing a little more than you meant to. Let that same softening move into your shoulders, into your jaw, into the small muscles behind your eyes that have been working even now without your notice. You do not have to earn this rest. You do not have to finish anything first, tonight or any night. You are allowed, simply, to be still, the way a beam is allowed to hold what it holds, without also sweeping the floor beneath it, without also tending the fire, without also lying awake, worrying about the family sleeping soundly under its protection. Not asked, not chosen, simply allowed, tonight, to be still, and somewhere close by, in another small room of the same long night, there is someone else who believes rest must wait until everything is finished, who has never once let it arrive before the very last task was done. Their story is only a little further ahead, waiting its turn the way all things eventually get their turn. Let yourself drift gently toward it, or let yourself drift toward sleep instead, whichever comes first. Either way, you have already set something down tonight that you have been carrying, quietly, for a very long time. There is, as it happens, someone else close by in this long night. Someone who has never once let rest arrive before the very last task was done. Who has spent years believing that stopping too early would be a kind of theft. A small dishonesty committed against everyone who was counting on the work getting finished properly. Their story begins the way most quiet obsessions do. Not with a dramatic vow, but with something as ordinary as fallen leaves, and a long stone path, and a boy who genuinely believed, for a long while, that rest was simply the thing that arrived after the last leaf was swept away. There is a version of tiredness that does not announce itself as tiredness at all. It dresses itself up as responsibility, as thoroughness, as simply finishing what was started. You tell yourself you will rest once the inbox is clear, once the house is tidy, once the last small thing is handled, and you believe this completely, every single time. Even though the inbox refills itself by morning, and the house collects new disorder within an hour, and the last small thing is never actually the last small thing. There is always one more. There is always a reasonable sounding argument for why now is still not quite the right moment to stop. And so the rest keeps sliding backward, a mile marker that moves whenever you get close to it, until entire seasons pass with the promise of rest, always waiting just past the next task. Forever one task away, forever almost here. This is not a failure of discipline. It rarely comes from laziness or a lack of trying. More often it comes from a quiet, unexamined agreement made somewhere along the way, that finishing is the price of being allowed to stop, and that stopping without finishing would mean something uncomfortable about your character, something you would rather not have to look at directly. So the list grows a little each day, and the rest owed to you grows along with it. And both keep being promised to some later version of yourself who never quite seems to arrive, no matter how many todays turn into yesterdays waiting for her. Buddhist teaching has long pointed to a simple, uncomfortable truth: conditioned existence offers no final state of completion to arrive at, no last task, after which all tasks stop, Because impermanence means the work of a household, a body, or a life is never finished in the way the mind imagines finished to be. What appears settled today will need attending to again tomorrow, not because anyone failed, but because that is the nature of things that are alive and changing. Waiting for a finish line before allowing rest is waiting for a place that was never on the map to begin with. In a mountain temple above Kamakura, in the 13th century, a young novice learned this the hardest way available to him. One stubborn autumn, one leaf at a time. The bell reached him first, its low bronze note rolling down from the hall and thinning out across the valley before it ever reached the lower gate. Closer, the dry scrape of his own broom moving over stone. And closest of all, directly beneath his sandals, the particular papery crunch of a maple leaf breaking under his heel, one of hundreds already fallen that morning, with hundreds more still clinging to the branches above the path. His name was Tetsu, and he was 17, and he had been given, 3 months earlier, the task of keeping the long stone approach to the main hall clear of leaves before the monks walked it each morning for meditation. He had decided, without anyone instructing him to decide this, that he would not eat his own breakfast and would not join the sitting himself until the path was entirely clear. Not mostly clear. Entirely. It seemed, to him, a simple enough standard. A path was either swept or it was not. Tetsu had arrived at the temple the previous spring, the third son of a merchant family who had never quite known what to make of him, and he had privately decided, somewhere in his first weeks there, that if he could not be the most naturally gifted at sitting meditation, he would at least be the most reliable, the one duty no one ever had to check on twice. The path had seemed, at first, like an easy place to prove this. A path was either swept or it was not. There was no ambiguity in it, no subtle failure the way there sometimes was in meditation, where he could never quite tell if he was doing it correctly at all. It was the 7th month of autumn duty, and Tetsu had not once finished before the bell called the others to sit. The maples above the path were old and enormous, said to have been planted by the temple's founder, and they did not release their leaves all at once out of any consideration for a novice's schedule. They let go steadily, continuously, 1 or 2 at a time, hour after hour, so that by the time Tetsu reached the end of the path, new leaves had already settled onto the section he had cleared first. He had begun arriving before dawn to gain an advantage. He had begun skipping the midday meal to keep working through the hours when the wind was calmest. He had grown thin and quiet, and the older monks had started to exchange glances about him that he pretended not to notice. Above the path, where it opened into the courtyard, the beam of the main hall's roof was visible through the trees, dark with age, holding the same weight it had held for centuries without once asking to be relieved of any of it. And some mornings Tetsu found himself looking up at it without quite knowing why. One grey morning, the Roshi found him on his knees at the path's midpoint, scooping wet leaves into a basket with hands that had gone numb from the cold. Breakfast untouched, the sitting bell already rung and already ignored. "The path is not clear," Tetsu said, before the old man could ask. "I cannot come in until it is clear." The Roshi lowered himself, slowly, to sit on the stone beside him, in no apparent hurry despite the cold. "How many mornings has it been clear when you finished?" Tetsu considered lying, and found he did not have the energy for it. "None. Not once." And how many more mornings do you expect before it finally stays clear? I don't know, Tetsu admitted. I keep thinking today will be the day. The tree does not know about your schedule, the Roshi said, not unkindly, gesturing upward at the branches, still heavy with color. It is not withholding leaves to test you. It is simply doing what maples do in the 10th month, which is release what no longer serves them, at whatever pace release happens to take. You have set your rest against a target that was never going to hold still long enough for you to reach it. Then what am I meant to do? Simply sweep less carefully. Sweep exactly as carefully as you have been sweeping, the Roshi said. But stop treating rest as the reward that arrives after the leaves stop falling. The leaves are not going to stop falling. Not this month. And if you are being honest with yourself, not really in any month, in any part of your life. Stop when the bell rings, not when the path agrees to hold still. But if I stop before it is clear, Tetsu said, how will anyone know I did the work properly? Who is it you imagine is keeping score? The Roshi asked. Tetsu opened his mouth to answer and found, to his own surprise, that he did not have a name ready. Not the abbot, not the other novices, who barely glanced at the path most mornings. Only some private judge inside him, one he had apparently installed himself, a long time before he ever arrived at this mountain. He opened his mouth again to argue that stopping still felt like giving up, like leaving the work undone, like admitting defeat to a pile of wet leaves. But some quieter part of him, underneath the argument, recognized something in the old man's words that landed before his pride could talk him out of hearing it. He looked down the path, at the sections he had cleared and the sections already softly recovering their scattered leaves, and understood, with a strange lightness that felt almost like grief, that he had spent 3 months chasing a finish line that the mountain itself had never agreed to draw. The bell rang again, calling the monks to the meal that followed sitting. Tetsu set down his basket, half full, the path only partly cleared, and for the first time in 3 months, he walked toward the hall instead of staying behind to finish. It was, unexpectedly, one of the hardest walks of his young life. His hands wanted to turn back. His mind kept insisting the leaves would multiply in his absence, would somehow judge him for leaving them. But his feet kept moving, one after another, away from the unfinished path and toward the sound of the other monks settling onto their cushions. And by the time he reached the doorway, the wanting to turn back had quieted into something closer to relief. He ate that morning for the first time in 3 days with any real appetite. The rice warm and plain and, for once, fully tasted rather than rushed through with half a mind still on the path outside. And when he returned to his broom afterward, the leaves were, of course, still there, along with a dozen new arrivals from the wind that had picked up while he ate. He swept them without hurry. He left, when the next bell rang, without finishing, and glanced up once at the old roof beam above the courtyard as he went, dark and patient and entirely unconcerned with whether the path below it was clear. The path was never once, in all his remaining years at the temple, entirely clear when he walked away from it. He came, eventually, to understand this as simply the nature of paths beneath maple trees, and not as a referendum on whether he had done enough. What Tetsu was actually protecting, underneath the broom, and the numb hands and the missed meals, was a private conviction that his worth as a novice, and perhaps, as a person, depended on reaching a state of completion that his task was never structured to allow. This is a subtle trap, because it disguises itself as diligence. It looks, from the outside, like devotion to the work, but underneath, it is often something quieter and sadder. A fear that stopping before the target is reached will reveal some laziness or unworthiness that the busyness had been concealing. The mind grasps at a finish line and calls the grasping responsibility. But conditioned things, the old teaching, reminds us, do not hold still long enough to be finished in the way the grasping mind wants. The inbox refills. The leaves keep falling. The bell rings again tomorrow, whether the path is clear or not. Perhaps you recognize the particular ache of promising yourself rest once everything is handled, and handling everything, and discovering there is always one more leaf on the path you had not accounted for. Perhaps you have skipped your own version of breakfast more times than you would like to admit, certain that today, finally, would be the day the path stayed clear, only to lie awake afterward wondering why the clearing never seemed to arrive. No matter how early you woke or how late you stayed, the tree does not know about your schedule. Sit with that sentence for a moment. It is not an accusation. It is closer to a permission slip, the kind you have been waiting years for someone to hand you. Think of the load of laundry that will need doing again by the weekend, no matter how well you finish it tonight. Or the emails that will have multiplied by morning, no matter how completely you empty the folder now. None of that means the folding or the answering did not matter. It only means the mind's private bargain, that rest arrives once the tasks stop needing you, was never a bargain the world had agreed to keep. Stop when the bell rings, not when the path agrees to hold still. Wherever you are, keeping a private tally tonight of what still needs finishing before you are allowed to rest. Let that tally soften now, just for these next few minutes. Feel the weight of your own body where it meets the bed, solid and supported, needing nothing further from you in order to be exactly where it already is. Let your breath come without you managing it, in its own unhurried rhythm, the way leaves fall without consulting anyone's calendar. Let your feet go heavy. Let your hands, wherever they have settled, stop rehearsing tomorrow's list. You do not have to reach the bottom of the list tonight. You do not have to reach the bottom of the list ever, because there is no bottom, only the bell, ringing again and again, offering you the same quiet invitation each time. Stop when the bell rings. Somewhere else, in this same night, there is a woman who has become so good at smiling through her own tiredness that the people who love her no longer think to ask if she is tired at all, because she never gives them a single reason to wonder. Her story is only a little further ahead, waiting patiently, the way all things eventually wait their turn. For now, let the leaves keep falling wherever they are falling, unswept and unhurried, needing nothing from you until whatever bell wakes you next. You do not have to sweep them tonight. You are already allowed to walk toward rest, unfinished path and all, the way Tetsu did, one ordinary evening, when he finally understood that the walking away was not a failure, but the whole point. Somewhere else in this same night, there is a woman who has become so good at smiling through her own tiredness that the people who love her no longer think to ask if she is tired at all, because she never gives them a single reason to wonder. Her story begins on a narrow strip of coastline, with the smell of salt and drying nets, and a habit she built so carefully, over so many years that even she nearly forgot it was a habit and not simply her face. There is a specific kind of loneliness in being the person whose sadness never seems to register as real to anyone else, because you have trained your face so thoroughly not to show it. You answer the question, "How are you?" the way you always answer it. Easily, warmly, before the person has even finished asking, and they move on satisfied, and you are left holding the actual answer, unspoken, because handing it to them would mean watching their face change, would mean becoming, even briefly, someone they had to worry about instead of someone they could simply lean on. So you keep performing steadiness, not out of dishonesty exactly, but out of a kind of protective love that has quietly convinced you that your tiredness is a burden you are responsible for hiding, the way you might hide a bruise, so no one asks how you got it. Over time, this becomes its own strange discipline, one you get remarkably good at. You learn exactly which tone of voice reassures people fastest. You learn to redirect a conversation the instant it turns toward how you are actually holding up. You become so skilled at appearing fine that even you sometimes lose track, for whole afternoons at a time, of what not fine would even feel like anymore. There is a teaching, old and simple, that suffering multiplied by concealment becomes heavier than suffering witnessed. What we hide in order to protect others from worry often isolates us instead, cutting the thread of connection that would have eased the weight in the first place. The Buddhist understanding of Sangha rests on the idea that no one is meant to carry difficulty in complete isolation, that being truly seen by even one other person is itself a form of relief, not a burden placed on them. Two women, in two corners of the Buddhist world, met this truth from opposite directions. One learned it by continuing to hide. The other learned it almost by accident, on an evening when she was simply too tired to keep hiding, and discovered the walls had never needed to be there at all. The tide came first. Its long, slow pull, audible even from inside the house. The water drawing back over stones with a sound like a held breath finally released. Closer, the creak of drying racks strung with fish, swaying slightly in the evening wind. And nearest of all, the small domestic clatter of her own hands, setting bowls on the table for a family that would be home within the hour, hungry and unaware. Her name was Hana, and she lived in a fishing village on the eastern coast of Japan, in the middle years of the Edo period, married to a man whose boat had gone down 8 months earlier in a spring storm that had taken 3 other boats from the same harbor with it. She had not cried in front of her children since the day the news arrived. She had decided, within the first terrible hour, that her son and daughter had already lost one steady presence in their lives and would not be permitted to lose another. And so she had built, board by board, the same way her husband had once built the boat that took him, a version of herself that never wavered where they could see it. She had chosen the comparison carefully, in her own mind, without ever saying it aloud. A boat that wavered in open water did not simply look unsteady. It capsized, and everyone aboard went down with it. She could not risk her children believing, even for a moment, that the one vessel left to carry them might do the same. The neighbors praised her endlessly for her strength, how well she was managing, how composed she remained, mending nets for coin, keeping the small garden fed, sending her children to the temple school with clean clothes and packed lunches, never once breaking down at the market the way certain other widows had. Hana accepted the praise the way she accepted everything now, with a small nod and a smaller smile. and told no one that she had started waking 2 hours before dawn, simply to have somewhere private to cry before the day required her face back. One evening, an old woman from 3 houses down, a distant aunt by marriage named Kiku, arrived unannounced with a pot of soup and sat herself down at Hana's table without asking. "You do not have to feed me a story tonight," Kiku said. Before Hana had said a word, "I did not come for one." Hana busied herself with bowls. "I don't know what you mean. I am well. The children are well." "I did not ask about the children." Kiku's eyes, pale with age, did not move from Hana's face. "I asked nothing at all. And you already began explaining how well everyone is." Hana's hands stilled over the bowls. "If I am not well," she said quietly, "then who takes care of them?" "Who takes care of you?" Kiku asked. "Someone has to be the steady one," Hana said. "My husband is gone. If I am not steady, there is no one left to be it." "There is a difference," Kiku said, "between being steady and being alone. You have made yourself the second while trying so hard to prove the first." The question landed somewhere Hana had not expected, somewhere beneath the version of herself she had built so carefully that even she had started to believe it was simply who she was. She opened her mouth to give the answer she always gave, the reassuring one, the one that ended the conversation quickly and let everyone return to feeling comfortable. Nothing came. Kiku did not press further. She only ladled soup into 2 bowls, set one in front of Hana, and began to eat her own, unhurried, as though she had nowhere else to be and no particular need for Hana to say anything at all. Hana did not cry that night, not in front of Kiku, not in front of anyone. Her children came home hungry and unaware, exactly as she had planned, and she fed them and tucked them into their sleeping mats and returned to the same practiced steadiness that had carried her for 8 months. But something in her had shifted very slightly, the way a board shifts before it finally cracks, not breaking yet, only remembering that it was capable of bending. What Hana was protecting her children from was real. Grief is heavy, and children should not be asked to carry more of it than belongs to them. But what she was also doing, underneath that real and loving instinct, was making a private rule that her own grief had nowhere left to go, that it had to be managed entirely alone, in the 2 hours before dawn, in a kitchen no one else ever saw. This is the quiet cost of concealment. It is rarely dishonest in its intention. It is usually love, wearing a mask it believes is necessary. But love that hides itself completely from everyone eventually has nowhere to rest, because rest requires being known, and being known requires letting at least one person see the bowl set down, the hands stilled, the question finally left unanswered. Who takes care of you? Sit with that question for a moment, the way Hana had to sit with it, unprepared, at her own table. Perhaps you have your own version of the 2 hours before dawn, some private hour or private room where the real answer finally gets to exist, briefly, before the practice face goes back on for everyone else. Perhaps it happens in a car in a parking lot before you walk into work, or in a shower where the water covers the sound, or in the last few minutes before sleep when there is finally no one left to reassure. That hour matters. It has kept you going, but it is not the only place the truth is allowed to live. The wind reached the hall first, a low, continuous moan through the bare branches above the mountain path. arriving muffled through the thick paper doors. Closer, the settling creak of old timber, cooling as the evening fire in the courtyard burned down to embers. And nearest of all, the small private sound of Siorin's own breath, shallow and effortful, in a way it had not been in years, as she lowered herself onto her cushion at the front of the hall, on the other side of the Buddhist world. In this small mountain nunnery in Korea during the Joseon period, an elderly nun named Siorin faced the same question Hana faced, and answered it differently, almost by accident. Siorin had led the nunnery's small community of students for 11 years, through a period when Buddhist practice was quietly tolerated rather than openly supported by the ruling court, which meant every visible weakness in a teacher felt, to her, like a risk the whole community could not afford. Nunneries in those mountains survived by seeming unshakable, self-sufficient, beneath the notice of anyone who might question their right to exist at all. Siorin had absorbed this necessity so completely that it had become indistinguishable, in her own mind, from simple good leadership. She had never once, in 11 years, told her students she was tired. One winter evening, after a day spent hauling firewood up the mountain path because the young novice normally assigned the task had fallen ill, Siorin sat down for the evening teaching and found, for the first time in memory, that she had nothing prepared to say. Her hands ached from the rope and the cold, the skin across her palms raw where the bark had rubbed it despite her calluses. Her voice, when she tried to begin, came out thinner than she intended, and for a moment she considered simply pushing through anyway, the way she always had, the way 11 years of habit told her a teacher was supposed to. "I do not have a teaching for you tonight," she said, into the silence of the hall. "I carried wood most of the day, and I am tired in a way I did not expect to still feel at my age." The younger nuns exchanged glances, uncertain, waiting for the correction, the recovery, the moment their teacher would gather herself and continue as she always did. It did not come. Siorin simply sat, hands resting on her knees, breathing, the firelight catching the deep lines of exhaustion in her face that she had, for 11 years, always managed to arrange herself before anyone could see. A young nun named Boe finally spoke. "Teacher, may I ask something?" Siorin nodded. "Were you always going to tell us this, or did it surprise you too?" Siorin considered the question honestly. "It surprised me," she admitted. "I believe I have been quietly convinced, for 11 years, that you all needed me to be tireless in order to feel safe here." "I feel safer now," Boe said, "than I have in a long while." Siorin looked up, startled. "Why would this make you feel safer?" "Because if you can be tired," Boe said slowly, working the thought out as she spoke it, "then perhaps I am allowed to be tired too, and it will not mean I have failed at this practice." "I worried," Siorin admitted, "that if you saw me falter, you would stop trusting the path I have been guiding you along." "I trust it more," Boe said, "now that I know a person walks it, and not only a teacher." The other nuns, one by one, began to nod, some of them close to tears, none of them looking at Siorin with anything resembling the alarm she had spent 11 years preparing herself to manage. What she found instead, in their faces, was something closer to relief, as if a door she had kept locked out of care for them had actually been keeping something warm from reaching the room. Above the hall, unseen in the dark. The old ridge beam that had carried the roof through generations of mountain winters held exactly as it always held. And Seorin, glancing up as her students settled into an easy silence around her, understood for the first time that a beam did not need to hide its weight in order to keep holding it. It simply held, visibly, and the roof stayed up regardless. She gave no teaching that night. Only let the fire burn down and let her students see her tired face in its light, and found, to her quiet astonishment, that nothing in the room had fallen. Hana hid her exhaustion because she believed her family needed her unwavering in order to feel safe. Seorin hid hers for the same reason, for 11 years, until one ordinary evening of exhaustion left her without the energy to keep hiding it, and she discovered the opposite of what she had feared. Both women were protecting the people they loved from a truth. Only one of them learned, and only because circumstance forced the discovery rather than choice, that the truth, once shared, did not collapse anything. It only made more room. This is not a call to abandon all discretion, to announce every private difficulty to everyone in range of hearing it. Grief and tiredness do not need an audience to be valid. It is something quieter, the recognition that letting one person see the actual weight you are carrying rarely produces the collapse you have spent years bracing against. More often, as Boe discovered, it produces permission. Permission that spreads outward in ways the person who first set it down rarely gets to witness. Who takes care of you? Were you always going to tell us this? Or did it surprise you too? 2 questions, 2 answers, 1 shared discovery. The mask protects no one as completely as it believes it does. If there is a version of your own face that has been holding steady for longer than it has wanted to, let it soften now. Here, where no one is watching and nothing needs to be managed. Let your jaw unclench from whatever practiced expression it has been holding. Let your shoulders drop the particular weight of always being the reassuring one, the composed one, the one whose tiredness never registers as real because you never let it show. You do not have to hide the 2 hours before dawn forever. You do not have to decide anything about that tonight. Just notice, gently, that the hiding has a cost, and that cost has a name, and its name is loneliness. And you are allowed, at least here, at least now, to set the mask down completely. Somewhere else in this long night, there is someone else learning that being useful and being enough were never quite the same thing, though it has taken them most of a lifetime to notice the difference. Their story is only a little further ahead. For now, let your own face rest. No one here is asking you to reassure them of anything at all. Somewhere else in this long night, there is someone else learning that being useful and being enough were never quite the same thing, though it has taken them most of a lifetime to notice the difference. Their story begins with a river, and a boat that no longer had anywhere to go, and a man who did not know what to do with his own hands once the crossing was no longer his to make. There is a particular kind of fear that only surfaces when the usefulness finally stops. The way a sound you have lived beside for years only becomes noticeable in the silence after it ends. You do not notice how much of your sense of self was built on being needed until the needing quietly goes elsewhere, to someone younger, or faster, or simply no longer required at all. And what is left standing in its place is a question you spent decades too busy to ask, who am I? When no one requires anything of me. It is a frightening question precisely because so much care went into never having to answer it. better to stay useful. Some part of the mind reasons, than to find out what remains underneath the usefulness once it is gone. Buddhist teaching speaks of the danger in building an identity on anything conditioned, anything that depends on circumstances outside your control, because conditioned things by their nature change, and an identity built entirely on being needed will eventually meet the moment when it is not. The deeper question beneath the fear of uselessness is rarely about usefulness at all. It is usually about whether one is lovable without it. Two lives, an ocean apart, circle this same fear from different depths. One meets it as a sudden absence of purpose. The other discovers it was hiding underneath the purpose the entire time. The river reached him first. Its wide, unhurried current, audible from his doorway even before he opened his eyes each morning. A sound so constant, he had stopped truly hearing it decades ago. Nearer. The creak of his boat's mooring rope against the old post where it had been tied every night for 40 years. And nearest of all, the particular stiffness in his own hands each dawn. The joints that had pulled an oar since before most of the town's residents were born. His name was Bo, and he had carried travelers across the river at Qingshui, in Song Dynasty, China, for 41 years, since he was a boy of 15, learning the current's moods from his own father, who had run the crossing before him. His father had died at the oars, in a manner of speaking, collapsing on the dock one autumn morning after 4 decades of the same work, and Bo had always privately understood this as a kind of completion rather than a tragedy. A life that had simply run its full length attached to the river that gave it purpose. He had assumed, without ever examining the assumption closely, that his own life would end the same way, oar in hand, is needed until the very last morning. A small wooden shelter stood at the dock where travelers once waited out of the rain, its roof held up by a single old beam that Bo had repaired himself twice over the decades, patching it with fresh timber whenever rot set in, keeping it standing long after the shelter's purpose had mostly become habit rather than necessity. The stone bridge had been under construction for 2 years, a provincial magistrate's project to connect the eastern and western markets without dependency on weather or water level. And everyone in Qingshui had known it was coming, had discussed it at length, had assured Bo repeatedly that people would still prefer the ferry for its lower price and its familiarity. Bo had believed them, mostly because believing anything else had seemed unbearable. The bridge opened on a clear morning in the 3rd month, with a small ceremony and firecrackers, and the magistrate's own carriage as the first to cross. By that afternoon, Bo's boat sat empty at its mooring for the first time he could remember on a market day. By the end of the first week, an entire day passed without a single traveler asking for the crossing. By the end of the 1st month, he understood, with a hollowness that surprised him in its size, that the ferry was finished. He kept coming to the dock anyway, every morning, out of a habit too deep to interrupt easily. He would untie the rope, check the hull for leaks, sit in the boat for an hour or 2 as though a traveler might still appear, then tie it again and walk home. His wife had died 6 years earlier. His son had moved to the provincial capital for work. The ferry crossing had been, without his quite noticing, the last remaining structure holding the shape of his days. The one appointment his body still understood how to keep, even after every reason for keeping it had quietly walked off across the new bridge. Neighbors who passed the dock in those weeks began greeting him more gently than before, the particular gentleness reserved for someone thought to be grieving something, though none of them, including Bo himself, could have said precisely what. One afternoon, a young monk traveling on foot rather than by the new bridge, out of what he called a preference for slower roads, stopped at the empty dock and found Bo sitting in his idle boat, staring at the water. "Are you still crossing travelers?" the monk asked. "No one needs crossing anymore," Bo said. "The bridge does it faster and for free." "Then why do you still come to the boat?" Bo considered lying, offering some practical answer about maintenance or habit, and found he did not have the energy for it. "I don't know what else to do with myself if I am not the ferryman," he admitted. 41 years, I have been the one who gets people across. If I am not that, I am not certain what remains. "Would you take me across anyway?" the monk asked. "Not because I need it. The bridge is right there. But I would like to sit in a boat crossing water with a man who knows this river better than anyone alive." Bo looked at him, uncertain whether this was kindness or foolishness. "You would pay to cross a river you could walk across for free." "I did not say anything about paying," the monk said, climbing in anyway. "There is a difference between a service and a companionship, though I understand why the two have felt like the same thing to you for so long." They crossed the river slowly, Bo rowing out of a rhythm his arms had never forgotten. The monk simply watching the water and the reflected clouds moving across it. Neither spoke for most of the crossing. When they reached the far bank, the monk did not step out of the boat right away. "You asked what remains. If you are not the ferryman," the monk said, "I noticed something on this crossing that had nothing to do with getting me anywhere. You know exactly when to lean into the current and when to let it carry you. You know where the water runs shallow even though nothing marks it. That knowledge did not arrive because people needed crossing. It arrived because you spent a life paying attention to a river. The paying attention is still yours. It does not require a passenger to remain real." Bo said nothing for a long moment, his hands resting on the oars, the boat rocking gently against the current he had spent 41 years reading like a second language. Above the empty dock behind them, the old shelter beam stood exactly as he had left it, holding up a roof that sheltered no one that afternoon, unbothered by the question of whether anyone needed its shelter in order for it to remain. Quite simply, still standing. What Bo lost when the bridge opened was real. A role, an income, a daily structure that had organized his life since boyhood. Grief for that loss is not confusion, it is simply grief, and it deserves to be felt rather than argued away. But underneath the grief for the role was a quieter, older fear. One, the monk's question exposed, without quite naming it, the fear that without the role, there was no self left worth knowing. This is a common trap in a mind that has spent decades earning its place through function. The function becomes so central that its absence feels like the absence of a person, rather than simply the absence of a task. But a life is not only the sum of what it produces for others. Bo's knowledge of the river, his read of its currents, his decades of quiet attention, none of that vanished when the bridge opened. Only the audience for it changed. Who am I, when no one requires anything of me? That question, faced honestly, rarely has a comfortable answer waiting immediately. But it is worth asking anyway, because the alternative, never asking it, means staying useful forever, simply to avoid finding out. Half a world away, in a village in the Red River Delta of Vietnam during the Ly dynasty, an elderly midwife named Cam met the same fear from underneath, in a place Bo's story never quite reached. Cam had delivered nearly every child born in her village for close to 50 years, called to bedsides at all hours, trusted by 3 generations of mothers who had themselves been delivered by her hands. She had never married, had no children of her own by blood, and had long ago stopped noticing how completely her sense of belonging in the village had come to rest on the small bronze bell by her door. The sound that meant someone needed her hands, needed her specifically, in a way that made one household's business become, briefly, the most important thing happening anywhere. She kept the bell polished, the way another woman might keep a wedding ring polished, though she had never once thought of it that way until much later. In recent years, a younger woman in the next village had trained formally at a provincial hospital and begun attending births with methods Cam did not fully understand but could see were, in some cases, genuinely safer. Families had started sending for her instead, quietly, almost apologetically, and the bronze bell by Cam's door had gone silent for longer and longer stretches. She told herself this was simply the way of things, generations passing skills forward. But some nights she found herself sitting beside the silent bell, unable to name the particular ache in her chest, only able to feel its shape, the way one feels the shape of a tooth that has gone missing, long before the tongue admits it is gone. One afternoon, a young woman named Tuyet, whom Cam had delivered 22 years earlier and had not seen much since her own marriage, arrived at Cam's door carrying a basket of food and no announcement of labor at all. "I am not due for another 2 months," Tuyet said, setting the basket down. "I only came to see you." Cam blinked, confused. "There is no need. I am sure your own midwife has everything prepared." "I know," Tuyet said. "That is not why I came." "Then why?" Cam asked, and heard, even as she said it, an edge of genuine bewilderment in her own voice. "Because you delivered me into this world with your own 2 hands," Tuyet said. "And my mother told me stories about you my whole childhood, and I wanted to sit with the woman those stories were about, not the midwife I might or might not need in 2 months." Cam sat with this for a long moment, the bronze bell silent by the door, the basket of food between them smelling of ginger and rice. "I have spent so many years believing people came to this door only when they needed hands to catch a child," she said slowly. "I am not certain what to do with someone at my door who needs nothing caught at all." "Then let us find out together," Tuyet said. They sat through the afternoon and into evening, talking of nothing urgent, the bell by the door staying exactly as silent as it had been. And Cam noticed, somewhere in the quiet unfolding of the hours, that the ache she had been sitting with on so many empty nights had, for these hours at least, gone still along with the bell. When Tuyet finally rose to walk home before dark, she left the empty basket behind, promising to collect it another day. For no reason at all, beyond wanting a reason to return, Bo believed the river crossing was the only thing he had to offer, and when it was no longer needed, he assumed he had become, in some essential way, unnecessary. Cam believed her hands were only welcome at her door when a birth required them, and had quietly organized her sense of belonging around that single function for half a century without ever testing whether it was true. Both discovered, from different directions, that what people valued in them ran deeper than the specific service attached to it. The monk valued Bo's attention to the river itself. Tuyet valued Cam herself, entirely apart from anything Cam's hands could do. This does not mean usefulness is meaningless, or that the roles we build over a lifetime do not matter. They matter enormously, but they were never the whole of the ledger, only the part that happened to be visible and easy to measure. The rest of the ledger, the part that draws a young woman to sit with an old midwife for no reason at all, was there the entire time, simply harder to notice while the bell kept ringing. Who am I when no one requires anything of me? Let us find out together, since neither of us has practiced this particular kind of visit very much. 2 questions, asked in 2 different centuries, pointing toward the same quiet discovery: you were never, only the service you provided. If some part of you has been quietly afraid of what remains when the usefulness runs out, let that fear rest for a moment now. Here, where nothing is required of you at all. You do not need to produce anything with this breath. You do not need to be helpful to the room, to the night, to anyone waiting on the other side of sleep. Let your hands go still, the way Bo's hands went still on the oars, the way Cam's hands went still beside a silent bell. Without either stillness meaning either of them had disappeared, you are allowed to simply be sat with tonight, needing nothing, caught, nothing crossed, nothing delivered. Let your breath move at its own pace, in and out, without asking anything of you in return. Somewhere else in this same long night, there is someone quietly afraid that softening even once will mean losing the ability to be strong again when it matters. Their story is only a little further ahead, waiting its turn. For now, let yourself be the one who is simply visited, simply sat beside, useful to no one, and entirely, quietly enough. Somewhere else, in this same long night, there is someone who has spent years believing that the moment they loosen their grip, everything they love will come apart at the seams. Their story begins with a merchant climbing a mountain path to a small monastery, carrying a question he did not yet know how to ask, and a Chan master who answered it with an image involving a very tall pole. There is a particular exhaustion that comes from believing you are the only thing holding a situation together, that your vigilance is load-bearing in some literal sense, that if you look away even briefly, something will slip, and everything built so carefully will come down. You check the same lock twice. You reread the same message 3 times before sending it. You cannot fully rest even in sleep, because some part of you stays on watch, cataloging what might go wrong if your attention wavers, even for the length of one unguarded breath. This vigilance rarely feels optional from the inside. It feels like the only thing standing between order and collapse, which makes setting it down feel less like relaxing and more like abandoning a post. There is a teaching, old and often misunderstood, that reaching a place of hard-won stability is not the end of practice, but only a resting point along the way, and that clinging to that stability out of fear of what comes next can become its own kind of prison. A height a person is too frightened to leave, even though staying there indefinitely was never actually possible. In the late years of the Tang dynasty, a merchant learned this from a Chan master who answered his question about safety with a question about a pole 100 feet tall. The mountain path reached his ears first, gravel shifting under sandals with each labored step upward, the sound of his own breath growing rougher than he liked to admit. Closer, the wind moving through pine branches on either side of the trail, cold and clean at this elevation. And nearest of all, the small metal clasp of the donation box he carried, tapping softly against his robe with each step, a sound that had become, over the years, strangely comforting to him. Proof that he still had something to offer in exchange for whatever he needed. His name was Y, and he was 46 years old, a silk merchant traveling to the mountain monastery of a Chan master named Sekiso to arrange a blessing for his ailing mother. Though the question that had been keeping him awake most nights had very little to do with his mother at all. Wei's father had died suddenly when Wei was 24, leaving behind a trading business teetering from 2 bad seasons and a warehouse fire. And Wei had spent the 22 years since rebuilding it into something stable through a vigilance he had never once relaxed. He still remembered, with a clarity that had not dulled in over 2 decades, the exact morning he had arrived at the family warehouse to find half the season's silk ruined by damp that a hired manager had failed to notice for nearly a week, having assumed, wrongly, that someone else was checking the roof. That single failure of attention had cost the family nearly a year's income and had planted in Wei a conviction he had never since questioned, that the moment his own eyes stopped watching every detail personally, ruin was not a possibility, but a certainty, waiting for its opening. He personally reviewed every ledger. He inspected every shipment before it left the warehouse. He knew the names and debts of every supplier, the moods and reliability of every clerk, because his father's collapse had taught him, at an age too young to question what it demanded of him, that a business left unwatched for even a season could fall to ruin. He found Sekiso in the monastery's small garden, pulling weeds from between rows of winter cabbage with the unhurried attention of a man who had nowhere else he needed to be. The garden was modest, terraced into the mountainside on a shelf of leveled earth, bordered by a low bamboo fence and shaded on one side by an ancient cypress whose roots had, over some decades, begun to lift the corner of an old stone wall without anyone apparently minding. Wei made his donation, arranged the blessing, and found himself, unexpectedly, still standing there afterward, unwilling to leave, watching the old monk's hands move through the soil with a patience that felt, after 3 days of hard travel and 22 years of harder vigilance, almost unbearable to witness. "You have more on your mind than your mother's health," Sekiso observed, without looking up from the cabbages. "My business has been stable for 11 years now," Wei said. "Profitable, well run. And yet I have not slept a full night in longer than I can remember, because I am certain that the moment I stop watching every detail myself, it will begin to fail the way it failed under my father." "How tall would you say your business has grown?" Sekiso asked. "In these 11 stable years?" Wei considered the strange question. "Very tall. I suppose taller than I once imagined possible." Sekiso finally straightened, brushing soil from his hands, and looked at Wei with an attention that felt, for the first time since Wei's arrival, entirely undivided. "Then let me ask you something a teacher once asked me, long before I understood it myself. If you were sitting at the top of a pole 100 feet high, having climbed there through great effort and skill, how would you proceed from that place? Not climb down, not stay frozen at the top out of fear of the fall. How would you go forward from the very top of the pole?" Wei frowned, turning the image over. There is nowhere to go from the top of a pole. Any movement at all would mean falling. That is what everyone believes, sitting at the top of their particular pole, Sekiso said. gripping the last few inches of it with white knuckles, certain that stillness is the only thing preventing disaster. He returned, unhurried, to the row of cabbages, speaking as much to the soil as to Wei. 11 years of watching every ledger has not once let you test whether your business, your clerks, your own body, might be capable of standing without your hand, gripping every last detail. You built the height yourself. You have simply never once let go long enough to discover that the height does not require the grip in order to remain a height. I don't know if I could, Wei admitted, more quietly than he intended. He stood there turning the image over in his mind. The pole, the height, the grip he had never once tested. 22 years of ledgers reviewed personally, shipments inspected with his own eyes. Clerks watched closely enough that none of them had ever been given the chance to prove themselves capable of anything more than what he directly supervised. He had built something tall, undeniably. He had simply never once discovered whether the height could hold itself. Then you are still at the top of the pole, Sekiso said, mistaking the grip for the achievement. The height was the achievement. The question is not whether you can hold on forever. You cannot. No one can. The question is whether you can step forward from the height you have already reached, trusting that the ground beneath 100 feet of real work is more solid than your fear is telling you. Wei looked down at the valley spread out below the monastery, his warehouses somewhere in the haze of distance, his clerks and ledgers and shipments continuing, at this exact moment, entirely without his direct supervision, exactly as they had for the 3 days it had taken him to travel here. Nothing, as far as he knew, had collapsed in his absence. I am afraid, he said quietly, of what I will discover if I finally look away. Most people at the top of the pole are, Sekiso said, returning to his cabbages. Go home. Do not climb down from what you have built. Simply take one step forward from the top of it. Wei stood a while longer in the small garden, watching the old monk's unhurried hands move among the cabbage rows, and noticed, above the garden gate, a modest wooden roof, held up by a single old beam, weathered grey, that had clearly stood through countless winters without anyone needing to grip it in place. It simply held, the way it had always held, requiring nothing further from anyone in order to keep doing so. Wei made his way back down the mountain path the following morning, and for the first time in 22 years, did not rehearse a single instruction for his clerks during the entire 3-day walk home. Wei had confused two very different things: the real, solid achievement of 11 stable years, and the exhausting belief that only his unrelenting grip was preventing that achievement from vanishing. This confusion is common in anyone who has once experienced real loss through inattention. The mind reasons, understandably, that vigilance caused the recovery, and therefore vigilance must continue forever, or the recovery will reverse itself. But a height reached through effort does not require the same desperate effort to remain a height. A tree does not keep straining upward to stay tall. It simply continues living, at whatever pace living requires next, still at the top of the pole, mistaking the grip for the achievement. Sit with that for a moment. So much of what feels like necessary vigilance is actually fear wearing the costume of responsibility, convinced that letting go of the last inch means losing everything built beneath it, when in fact the building itself was never in the grip. It was always in the work already done. How would you proceed from the top of your own 100-foot pole, not falling, not staying frozen. Simply one step forward, into ground. Your fear has not yet let you notice is already there. The next morning, in a household several provinces away, a widow named Rong faced a much smaller version of the same fear and chose, for the first time in years, to step forward from the top of her own pole. Rong's husband had died 4 years earlier, leaving her to raise their son Feng largely on her own. And in that time she had come to believe, quietly and without ever quite examining the belief, that her constant guidance was the only thing standing between Feng and the kind of costly mistake that could set the family back for years. Feng was 16, old enough to travel to the market town alone to collect payment from a debtor his late father had left behind. A task Rong had always insisted on handling herself or accompanying him for, certain that Feng, gentle and still, somewhat unworldly, could not manage the negotiation without her guidance close at hand. That morning, her back troubled her badly enough that the usual trip seemed unwise, and she found herself facing an uncomfortable choice: postpone the collection, which the family could not easily afford to do, or let Feng go alone. She stood at the door a long while, rehearsing every instruction she might give him, every worry about what could go wrong, before finally saying only, "Ask for the full amount first. If he argues, listen more than you speak. You will know what to do." Feng looked at her, surprised by the brevity, clearly expecting a longer list, the kind she usually gave before he left the house for anything at all. That's all. No instructions about what to say if he claims he already paid part of it, or what to do if he isn't home. That's all, Rong said, though her chest was tight with the effort of not saying more, of not following him out the door with a dozen contingencies he had not asked for. "You are not coming with me at all?" Feng asked, pausing at the threshold, and Rong heard, underneath the practical question, something else. A boy checking whether his mother's trust in him was real or only a performance she was too tired to maintain that morning. "Not today," she said. "You will know what to do." She spent the morning finding small tasks to occupy her hands, unable to fully settle, checking the window more than the actual work in front of her required. When Feng returned before midday, sun-flushed and slightly proud of himself, the debt collected in full, she felt something in her shoulders loosen that she had not realized was clenched. He tried to argue the amount, Feng told her, "But I just waited, the way you said, and he paid it." Rong said nothing for a moment, watching her son set the coin pouch on the table with the easy confidence of someone who had just discovered a capability he did not know he had. She had spent 4 years believing her presence was the only thing standing between her family and disaster. This one ordinary morning, without her, nothing had fallen. Something, in fact, had grown taller. Wei feared that stepping back from constant vigilance would collapse 11 years of careful building. Rong feared that stepping back from constant guidance would leave her son unprepared for an ordinary negotiation. Both discovered, in their own scale and their own morning, that what they had built, whether a business or a capable son, did not actually depend on their hands, remaining clenched around every detail. The height was already real. Only the grip was optional. This is not an argument for carelessness, for abandoning genuine responsibility or walking away from things that still need tending. It is something narrower and more forgiving, the recognition that a life or a family or a business built through real effort develops its own solidity over time. solidity that does not require the original vigilance to continue at full intensity forever in order to remain standing. How would you proceed from the top of your pole? That's all, though her chest was tight with the effort of not saying more. 2 moments, 2 very different scales, 1 shared discovery. The ground beneath 100 feet of real work is more solid than fear tends to admit. If some part of you has been gripping the top of your own 100-foot pole tonight, certain that loosening even slightly will bring everything down, let your hands soften now. Here, where nothing actually needs holding at this exact moment. Let your fingers uncurl from whatever they have been clenched around, whether that is a person, a plan, or simply the idea that you alone are what keeps things standing. Feel the solid ground of everything you have already built, quietly continuing to exist, whether or not your attention is fixed on it this instant. It does not need your grip to remain real. It only ever needed your work, and the work is already done for tonight. Somewhere else, in this same night, there is someone who postponed their own grief for so long, staying composed for everyone else's sake, that they nearly forgot grief was still waiting for them, patiently, whenever they were finally ready. Their story is only a little further ahead. For now, let your hands rest open, holding nothing, and notice that nothing falls. Somewhere else, in this same night, there is someone who postponed their own grief for so long, staying composed for everyone else's sake, that they nearly forgot grief was still waiting for them, patiently, whenever they were finally ready. Their story begins in a small forest monastery in Thailand, with a bell that would not stop needing to be rung, and a young abbot who did not have permission, in his own mind, to fall apart. There is a specific kind of delay that grief takes on when the world does not pause to accommodate it. The arrangements still need making. The people around you still need steadying, especially the ones who are struggling more visibly than you appear to be. So you fold your own loss into a small, manageable shape, set it carefully to one side, and promise yourself you will return to it once things have settled, once the immediate obligations have passed, once there is finally room. And then, often, there never quite is room, because life keeps arriving with its next requirement, and the grief, patient and uncomplaining, simply waits in the place you left it, sometimes for months, sometimes for years, never once demanding to be noticed, which somehow makes it easier to keep forgetting it is there. This is a particular cruelty reserved for the capable one, the composed one, the person others instinctively turn to in a crisis. Your own crisis rarely receives that same instinctive attention from anyone, including yourself, because you have spent so long being the steady presence in the room that no one, yourself included, thinks to ask whether the steady presence is also, quietly, breaking underneath the steadiness. The world rewards this composure so consistently, with gratitude and admiration and relief, that it becomes difficult to imagine setting it down even for an evening, even alone, even when no one else would ever know the difference. The Buddha taught, in what has come to be called the parable of the 2 arrows, that pain is often followed by a second, self-inflicted wound, not the loss itself, but the story we tell ourselves about needing to manage the loss invisibly, to carry it without letting it interrupt anyone else's day. The first arrow is grief. The second arrow is the belief that grief must be postponed indefinitely in service of everyone else's comfort. That composure is a debt owed to the people watching, rather than a temporary shape grief happens to be wearing that day. In a forest monastery in northern Thailand, a young abbot learned the difference between the two arrows in the days following his mother's death, while the funeral bell for someone else's grandmother would not stop ringing, asking more of him before he had finished asking anything of himself. The bell reached the meditation hall first, its low bronze tone rolling out across the monastery grounds and settling into the surrounding teak forest like something released rather than struck. Closer, the rustle of saffron robes as monks rose from their cushions to answer its call. And nearest of all, the particular tightness in his own chest, the one Fra Sombun had been carrying for 6 days without once naming it aloud. His mother had died on a Tuesday, quietly, in her sleep, at the small house at the edge of the village where she had lived her whole life, the same house where she had once packed his small bag of belongings the morning he left, at age 12, to begin his novice training. Fray Sombun, 31 years old and abbot of the monastery for only 2 years, had conducted her cremation rites himself, the way tradition required. Standing before the assembled village, with a composure that had impressed everyone and cost him something he had not yet found the time to measure. Villagers had remarked afterward, with evident admiration, on how gracefully their young abbot had led his own mother's funeral, how steady his chanting had remained, how he had comforted 3 separate weeping relatives before the ashes had even cooled. No one had thought to ask him the same question he had asked so many others over the years. Are you carrying more than you are saying? He had assumed, in the days that followed, that grief would find its moment once the immediate duties passed. It did not get the chance, and looking back later, he would wonder whether any moment truly waits patiently for grief the way we imagine it will, or whether we simply have to choose one, deliberately, before life offers another duty to fill it instead. 3 days after his mother's cremation, an elderly woman in the village, the grandmother of 6 children who attended the monastery school, passed away as well, and the family came to Fra Sombun, as was proper, to ask him to lead her funeral rites too. He said yes. Of course, he said yes. It was his duty, and the family's grief was, in that moment, more visibly urgent than his own carefully folded version of the same thing. He led the rites with the same steady composure he had shown at his mother's cremation, chanting the same verses, offering the same comfort to a room full of people who had no idea that the young abbot guiding them through their loss was underneath his robes, still standing inside his own. It was Nan, the temple's elderly caretaker, who noticed first, on the evening after the second funeral, watching Fra Sombun extinguish the hall's candles with hands that moved a fraction too carefully, as though managing something fragile. Above them, in the flickering candlelight, the meditation hall's old roof beam threw a long shadow across the floor, the same beam that had held the hall's roof steady through some 40 monsoon seasons, weathering storms far larger than anything either man standing beneath it that evening had yet weathered themselves. You have not cried once, Nan said, not as an accusation, simply as an observation offered into the quiet hall. There has not been a good time, Fra Sombun said, continuing his careful work with the candles. There will never be a good time, Nan said. I have watched you lead 2 funerals in 6 days and comfort 2 grieving families, and I do not believe you have once let yourself be the grieving person in the room. Fra Sombun set down the candle snuffer. If I fall apart, who leads the rites? who comforts the families who need comforting right now. My grief can wait a little longer. It has waited this long already. The Buddha taught something about that waiting, Nan said quietly. The first arrow is your mother's death. That arrow struck 6 days ago, and there was nothing to be done about it. But this second arrow, this belief that your own grief must stay folded up and set aside indefinitely so that it never once interrupts anyone else's need, that arrow you are choosing to loosen into yourself, day after day, and no one is making you do it. Someone has to hold steady, Prasombun said, though his voice, for the first time in 6 days, had lost some of its careful evenness, cracking very slightly on the last word, in a way he seemed to notice even as he said it. Holding steady and holding everything are not the same duty, Nan said. You led the rites. You comforted the families. That was real, and it mattered. But you have also convinced yourself that your own mother does not deserve the same grieving room you gave so easily to a woman you barely knew. Ask yourself honestly which one of you decided that. Prasombun was quiet for a long moment, the candlelight wavering between them. I don't think I decided it, he said slowly. I think I simply never noticed there was a decision being made at all. That is how the second arrow usually travels, Nan said. Quietly, disguised as duty, never once announcing itself as a choice. Prasombun stood very still in the candlelit hall, the truth of it moving through him slowly. The way water finds its way into dry ground, it has been sitting above for days. He thought of his mother's hands, the particular way she had folded his monk's robes when he first entered the monastery as a boy, the sound of her laughter, which he realized, with a fresh and startling ache, he had not once allowed himself to properly miss. I don't know how to start, he admitted. You have already started, Nan said gently. You just gave the second arrow a name. That is usually where it begins. That night, alone in his small quarters after the temple had gone quiet, Prasombun finally wept for his mother. 6 days late, the sound muffled against a folded robe so as not to wake the younger monk sleeping nearby. It was not graceful. It was not composed. It was, for the first time in 6 days, entirely and only his own. He wept for the sound of her laughter, and for the particular way she had once folded his robes, and for the ordinary Tuesday afternoons he had assumed, without ever examining the assumption, that he would always eventually have more of. When it finally passed, sometime past midnight, he lay in the dark, listening to the ordinary sounds of the monastery settling around him, and felt, for the first time, since the bell had first rung 6 days earlier, something in his chest that was not tightness at all, but simply, quietly, a room. The following morning, Prasombun rose before the other monks, as he always did, and made his way to the meditation hall to light the candles for the dawn chanting. The old roof beam sat above him exactly where it always sat, holding exactly what it had always held, and he found himself standing beneath it a moment longer than usual, looking up at the weathered grey wood with something that felt, for the first time, less like comparison and more like companionship. He did not feel healed. The grief had not left him, and he understood, with a clarity that surprised him, that it likely never fully would. But it no longer felt like something he was managing in secret, a private weight disguised behind a public composure. It simply felt like something he was, finally, allowed to carry openly, the way the beam carried the roof, visibly, without needing to pretend the weight was not there at all. Fra Sombun's duty to his community was real, and leading those rites was not a mistake or a failure of self-care. Grief does not require the world to stop, and sometimes tending to others in the immediate aftermath of loss is itself a form of grieving, a way of staying close to what matters while the larger wave has not yet arrived. But somewhere inside that real duty, he had quietly added a second, unnecessary rule, that his own grief was not permitted the same room he so readily gave to others. The first arrow is the loss. The second arrow is the belief that grief must wait, indefinitely, until it is convenient for everyone else. This second arrow is the one we have some choice about, even when the first one lands without warning and without our permission. You just gave the second arrow a name. That is usually where it begins. Perhaps you have your own version of the folded, set-aside grief, some loss you managed so gracefully in front of others that you never quite got around to feeling it yourself. Perhaps it was a parent, or a friendship, or a version of your own life that quietly ended while you were busy holding everyone else steady through some other crisis, some other family's more visible emergency. It is still there, patient and uncomplaining, exactly where you left it, in no hurry, waiting only for the moment you finally stop asking it to wait a little longer. The Buddha did not teach that grief itself was the problem to be solved. He taught that the second arrow, the belief that grief must be managed invisibly and indefinitely, was the wound we had some real choice about. Naming that second arrow does not undo the first. It simply stops the bleeding you were adding on top of it, quietly, every single day, without ever quite noticing you were doing it. That is how the second arrow usually travels. Quietly, disguised as duty, never once announcing itself as a choice. It rarely arrives dressed as neglect of yourself. It arrives dressed as care for everyone else, which is precisely what makes it so easy to carry for far longer than it was ever meant to be carried. If there is a grief you have postponed tonight, fold it carefully to one side, while you tended to everyone else's more visible need. Let yourself simply notice it now, without any obligation to do anything about it yet. You do not have to weep the way Fra Sombun finally did. You only have to let yourself know, gently, that it is still there, and that its waiting was never a punishment, only patience. Let your chest soften around whatever it has been holding carefully in place. Let your breath move a little deeper than it has all day, reaching into the space grief has been quietly occupying without complaint. There is no schedule for this. There is no correct amount of time that must pass before feeling something fully becomes allowed. The room Fra Sombun finally found himself, the quiet space where tightness had been, is available to you too. Whenever you are ready to stop asking it to wait, whether that is tonight or some other night further along, whenever the waiting finally becomes heavier than the letting in, somewhere else in this same long night, there is someone afraid that softening even once, allowing themselves to feel something fully, will mean losing the ability to be strong again when it truly matters. Their story is only a little further ahead. For now, simply let what has been waiting continue to wait a little longer, if it must, but know that you are allowed, whenever you are ready, to finally let it in. A colder country holds the next story. A man kneeling at the edge of a frozen pond beside his daughter, discovering that a still bird might be teaching him something. 11 years of iron discipline never did, as though gentleness were a door that only opened one way, and he was only now, for the first time, testing the hinge. There is a particular fear that lives underneath the fear of falling apart, a fear less about the falling apart itself than about what might happen afterward, whether the hardness that has protected you for so long would still be available when you needed it again. You imagine softening as a kind of dissolving, a one-way door, as though grief or tenderness, once let in fully, might simply take up permanent residence and never again allow you to be the steady, capable person everyone, including yourself, has come to depend on. So you keep the door shut, not because you do not feel the ache behind it, but because you are genuinely uncertain whether you would be able to close it again once it opened. There is a teaching, quiet and easily overlooked, that the qualities we call strength and softness are not opposites locked in permanent competition, but states a healthy mind moves between. The way water moves between ice and flow, depending entirely on what the moment requires, without either state erasing the water's essential nature. Ice is not more truly water than flow is. Neither is a betrayal of the other. In a mountain village in northern Japan, a former soldier learned this. The winter upon taught him something his years of discipline had not. The wind reached the pond first, a low, steady moan across the frozen surface that had been building since morning. Closer, the fine creak and shift of ice settling under its own weight, an old sound he had learned to recognize each winter. And nearest of all, the particular stillness of his own breath, held a fraction longer than necessary, the way it had been held, in one form or another, for 11 years. His name was Kenji, and he had fought in 3 campaigns before laying down his sword at 34 to return to the small mountain village where he had been born, marrying, raising 2 daughters, and building a quiet reputation as a man who could be relied upon in any crisis, precisely because nothing seemed to move him. Neighbors spoke of him with genuine admiration, the way villagers speak of a well that has never once run dry. And Kenji had come to understand his own worth, largely through that reputation, without ever quite examining what it cost him to maintain it. He had not wept once since the war. Not at his own father's funeral, where he had stood at the front of the mourners with a composure other men twice his age had struggled to match. Not when his elder daughter had nearly died of fever at 4 years old, a night he had spent completely still beside her bed, while his wife wept openly beside him, his own face arranged into the same unmoving calm he had worn through 3 campaigns. He had told himself, in the years since, that his steadiness during that fever had been the reason she survived, that his calm had somehow held the household together while panic would have made everything worse, and he had never once questioned whether the steadiness and the survival were actually connected at all, or whether he had simply needed to believe they were. That afternoon, walking the frozen pond's edge on his way home from the market, he found his younger daughter, Emmy, kneeling at the ice's border, weeping over a small bird she had found frozen and motionless in the reeds. "It's not moving," she said, when she saw him. "I think it's dead. I don't want it to be dead." Kenji knelt beside her, examining the small shape, and found, to his own surprise, that his throat had tightened in a way he did not immediately recognize. He busied himself instead with practical reassurance. birds sometimes go still in the deep cold. It may simply be resting. An old woman from the village, gathering firewood nearby, overheard and came to look. She was Obaasan Yuki, 80-some years old, small and unhurried in her movements, who had buried a husband and 3 of her own children over a long life and had, somehow, never once developed the particular hardness Kenji had spent 11 years cultivating. The village children adored her precisely because she cried openly at their small triumphs and losses alike. And yet no one in the valley would have called her weak. If anything, her willingness to feel things fully had only ever seemed to deepen the respect people held for her. "May I?" she asked, and gently lifted the small bird, cupping it inside both weathered hands, breathing warm air slowly across its feathers. "It's frozen," Kenji said. "There is nothing to be done." "Frozen is not the same as gone," Yuki said, continuing her slow, patient warming. "Watch the pond, Kenji-san, if you do not believe me about the bird." He looked at the frozen surface, stretching out before them, solid enough that children sometimes walked across it in the coldest weeks. "The pond is frozen too. It will stay frozen until spring." "And in spring," Yuki asked, still cradling the bird, "it melts. It becomes water again, the way it always does." "Does the water resent the ice for having happened?" Yuki asked. "Does it refuse to freeze again the following winter, afraid that thawing once means it can never be solid again?" Kenji said nothing, watching the small bird's chest, willing it to move. "You have been frozen a very long time, Kenji-san," Yuki said, not unkindly. 11 years, if the village gossip has the count right. "You believe, I think, that if you thaw even once, you will not be able to freeze again when your family needs the ice beneath their feet. But water was never only ice. It was never only flow either. It has simply, always, been water, taking whatever shape the season asked of it." The bird's chest moved, faintly, once, and then again. Emi gasped, delighted, and Yuki carefully wrapped the small creature in a fold of her sleeve to carry home for warming by the fire. Kenji remained kneeling at the pond's edge a moment longer than the others, looking at his own reflection faintly visible through a thin, clear patch of ice near the shore, undistorted, entirely himself, neither frozen nor flowing, simply present. "I have been afraid," he admitted quietly, to no one in particular, "that if I ever let myself feel it, all of it, I would not know how to stop." Yuki, already walking back toward the village with the bird cradled against her chest, called back over her shoulder without turning, "You will stop when the season calls for stopping. It always has, for every pond in this valley, every winter for longer than any of us have been alive. Trust the water, Kenji-san. It knows its own way home better than your 11 years of standing guard over it ever could." That evening, alone after his daughters had gone to sleep, Kenji sat beside his own hearth, the fire's warmth reaching his hands in a way that felt, that night, unusually vivid, and for the first time in 11 years, allowed himself to remember his father's funeral fully, the actual weight of it, rather than the composed version he had performed for the mourners. He wept for perhaps 20 minutes, quietly, his wife's hand eventually finding his shoulder without either of them needing to explain why. Her fingers warm against the cold place he had not realized he was still carrying. When it passed, he found himself still entirely capable of rising the next morning, lighting the hearth, walking his daughters to the temple school, exactly as steady as he had always been, only lighter for having finally let something move through him instead of only ever standing guard against it. Kenji had confused two very different things: his genuine capacity to remain steady in a crisis, and a private, untested rule that any softening at all would permanently dissolve that capacity. The rule had never actually been tested in 11 years, because he had never once allowed himself to find out. Fear, left unexamined long enough, tends to promote itself to certainty. Frozen is not the same as gone. Sit with that for a moment. So much of what we protect through hardness is actually still there, waiting, underneath the ice, in no danger of disappearing simply because it finally gets the chance to move. Water was never only ice. It was never only flow either. It has simply, always, been water. Whatever strength you have built through years of careful control is not erased by one evening of feeling something fully. It is only, for that evening, taking a different shape, the way every pond in every valley eventually does, and always has, long before anyone worried it might forget how to freeze again. The fear that softening is permanent is rarely tested honestly. It is simply assumed, early, and then reinforced by every year that passes, without the test ever actually happening. In a city several provinces to the south, a businesswoman named Reiko had discovered the opposite truth from a different kind of winter, and had, over many years, forgotten there was a spring on the other side of it at all. Reiko had once been, by her own family's account, a warm and openly affectionate young woman, the kind who cried easily at films and hugged her employees on their birthdays, who kept a small dish of sweets on her desk for anyone who looked like they were having a hard day. That warmth had cost her badly in her 20s, during a business partnership that collapsed when her trusted partner used her openness against her. Forging her signature on documents she had been too trusting to read carefully, walking away with both the company's funds and her willingness to be caught unguarded again. She had rebuilt her business alone, successfully, over the following decade, and had rebuilt herself alongside it, deliberately, methodically, into someone who did not cry, did not hug, did not allow anyone close enough to use her softness as a weapon a second time. Colleagues respected her. Few claimed to know her. 20 years later, her adult son, Haruto, sat across from her in her spotless, orderly office, having just told her, with visible difficulty, that his marriage was ending. "I see," Reiko said, her voice even, already reaching for a folder of paperwork related to an unrelated matter. "Have you spoken to a lawyer about the practical arrangements?" Haruto stared at her. "I just told you my marriage is over, and you're asking about paperwork." "Paperwork is what actually helps in these situations," Reiko said. "Emotion does not fix anything." "I don't need you to fix anything," Haruto said, his voice cracking slightly. "I need you to be my mother for 5 minutes instead of my accountant." Reiko set down the folder, startled by the sharpness in his voice, more startled still by how foreign the request felt after so many years of practiced distance. "I don't know how to do that anymore," she admitted, quietly, the confession surprising her as much as it seemed to surprise him. I was so certain that hardness was the only thing keeping this company and this family standing, that I forgot to check whether there was still someone soft underneath it. Haruto was quiet for a long moment, studying his mother's face as though seeing something there for the first time in years. Is she still in there? I don't know, Reiko said honestly. I have not gone looking in a very long time. She looked down at her own hands, folded neatly on the desk between them. Hands that had once, she dimly remembered, reached easily for other people, without calculating the risk first. Outside her office window, the city continued its ordinary evening rush, entirely unaware that something small and long frozen had just, for the first time in 2 decades, been asked whether it still remembered how to move. Kenji feared that softening even once would permanently dissolve the hardness protecting his family. Reiko, further down the same road, had already lived the fear he had not yet tested, and discovered that hardness maintained without exception for 20 years does not stay handy and protective, waiting patiently for the moments that truly need it. It simply becomes the only shape left, indistinguishable. Eventually, from the person underneath it, the two of them show, from opposite ends of the same fear, what Yuki understood, watching the frozen pond, that a healthy strength moves between states as circumstances require, and that a strength which refuses to ever move, which insists on staying frozen permanently out of fear of what thawing might cost, eventually loses something. Water was never meant to lose its capacity to become anything else at all. Frozen is not the same as gone, Yuki told Kenji. I don't know, Reiko told her son, whether the soft version of me is still in there. One woman spoke from having tested the fear and found relief. The other spoke from having avoided the test so completely, for 20 unbroken years, that she genuinely no longer knew what she would find if she finally looked. If some part of you has been standing guard over your own softness, certain that letting it move even once means losing your strength for good, let that guard rest for just this moment. Here, where nothing needs protecting right now. You are not being asked to dissolve. You are only being asked to notice that water beneath ice is still water, still entirely itself, patient and whole, waiting only for a season that allows it to move. Let your chest loosen from whatever careful freeze it has been maintaining. Let your breath come a little more freely than it has all day. Nothing about feeling this fully for these next few minutes erases your capacity to be steady again tomorrow, or the day after, or whenever steadiness is genuinely needed again. It only proves, the way it proved for Kenji beside that pond, that you were always more than the ice alone, and that the water underneath has been waiting patiently this entire time. Somewhere else in this same night, there is someone learning that being strong for the people they love and being truly present with them were never quite the same thing, though it took most of a lifetime to notice the difference. Their story is only a little further ahead. For now, let yourself simply be water, taking whatever shape tonight happens to ask of you. That cold country fades, and the story continues in a warmer season, generations earlier, in a monastery in Tang Dynasty, China, where a devoted attendant monk had spent years believing his most important duty was making certain his teacher never once appeared anything less than perfectly composed in front of the community, mistaking that careful arrangement for the deepest form of loyalty a student could offer. There is a particular exhaustion in believing that your presence with someone matters only insofar as it protects them, manages the room around them, keeps everything running smoothly enough that no one has to see anything uncomfortable. You show up. You handle things. You field the difficult questions before they reach the person you are protecting. And somewhere, in all that careful management, presence quietly gets replaced by performance. The performance of strength on someone else's behalf, until you can no longer tell whether you are actually with the person you love or simply standing guard in front of them. This confusion is easy to miss because it wears the costume of devotion so convincingly. You are, after all, doing something for them, arranging their environment, absorbing the difficult parts so they do not have to. It looks like love from every angle, except the one that matters most, whether you are actually staying in the room with them as they are, or quietly excusing yourself to the doorway, where you can keep watch without having to witness anything you cannot fix. The people on the receiving end of this kind of care often sense the distance before they can name it. They feel managed rather than accompanied, protected rather than known, and something in them quietly stops reaching for the deeper contact they actually needed, settling instead for the competent version of closeness that was on offer. There is a teaching, subtle and often missed, that being strong for someone and being genuinely present with them are not the same offering, and can sometimes work directly against each other, since strength performed on another's behalf often requires hiding the very thing that would let real presence occur. To be strong for someone, in this sense, is to manage what they are permitted to witness. To be present with them is to stay exactly where the witnessing actually happens, however uncomfortable that place turns out to be. This distinction rarely announces itself clearly. It hides inside gestures that look, from every visible angle, like devotion. In a monastery in Tang Dynasty, China, a devoted attendant learned the difference between the two, while his teacher, the Chan master Dongshan, lay seriously ill and refused to let his own illness be quietly managed away. The monastery bell reached the sick room first, muffled through its paper screens, calling the community to the evening meal without him. Closer, the rasp of Dongshan's own breathing, labored in a way it had not been the previous winter, each inhale drawn with visible effort. And nearest of all, the quiet shuffle of his attendant Huran's sandals, pacing a worn path across the floorboard outside the door, unable to settle. Straightening the same stack of folded blankets for the second time that hour, though nothing about them required straightening. Huran had served Dongshan for 11 years, since arriving at the monastery as a frightened boy of 14, with no family left to speak of, and had built, over that time, a private sense of purpose around one central task, making certain that nothing ever disturbed the community's faith in their teacher's steadiness. It was, in a way, the only form of usefulness he had ever fully trusted himself to provide. Having arrived with no particular gift for chanting or calligraphy or the sitting practice itself, only a talent for noticing what might go wrong before anyone else noticed it. When visiting monks asked difficult questions, Huran answered the simple ones himself to spare Dongshan the interruption. When Dongshan grew tired during long teachings, Huran found reasons to end the session early without anyone noticing the fatigue behind it. It had become, without his quite realizing it, the entire shape of his devotion, so thoroughly woven into his sense of self that he could no longer easily separate serving his teacher from managing what his teacher was allowed to be seen as. So when Dongshan fell seriously ill that winter, his lungs filling with a heaviness the monastery physician could not fully name, only treat with bitter decoctions and careful watching. Huiran's first instinct was managed silence. He told visiting monks the teacher was in deep retreat and could not be disturbed. He turned away a young monk from a neighboring monastery who had walked 3 full days specifically to ask Dongshan a question that had been troubling him for months, offering some vague and practiced excuse about the winter teaching schedule. Watching the young man's shoulders fall with disappointment, without once reconsidering his decision. He kept the sickroom door closed, the illness contained, the community's picture of their unshakable teacher carefully undisturbed, checking on him every hour with a devotion that felt, to Huiran himself, entirely above reproach. Dongshan, from his bed, weak but entirely lucid, finally asked why the young visiting monk had left without being announced. The sickroom was small and plain, its single beam overhead darkened with decades of incense smoke, holding up a roof that had sheltered generations of ill and dying monks before Dongshan, without ever once requiring the room beneath it to pretend those illnesses away. "I did not want to trouble you," Huiran said. "You are unwell. It seemed wrong to let anyone see you struggling to breathe, struggling to speak. They come here for steadiness. I did not think it right to show them anything else." "Bring him back," Dongshan said. Huiran hesitated. "Master, you can barely sit upright." "Bring him back," Dongshan said again, gently but without room for further argument, his eyes steady. Despite the visible effort, each word now seemed to cost him. "You have spent 11 years protecting a version of me that only exists when nothing is wrong. That is not the same as serving me. It is closer to serving your own fear of what people might think if they saw me as I actually am." Huiran, Stung, retrieved the young monk from the guest house, who entered the sickroom nervously, clutching the sleeves of his traveling robe, clearly unprepared for how frail his teacher's teacher appeared against the pillows, the lamplight catching the hollows beneath Dongshan's eyes in a way that made his illness impossible to soften with words. The young monk had walked 3 days through early winter cold to ask his question, rehearsing it at every mile marker, and now stood at the threshold uncertain whether asking it at all had become, suddenly, a cruelty. Dongshan gestured him closer, his hand trembling slightly with the effort. "You did not walk 3 days to stand at my door," he said, his voice thin but not unkind. "Ask what you came to ask." "You are ill, Master," the young monk said, uncertain how to proceed. "But is there anyone who does not get ill?" "There is," Dongshan said, his voice thin but steady. "Does the one who does not get ill look after you?" the young monk asked. "I look after him," Dongshan said. The young monk frowned, working through the strangeness of the answer. "How is it when you look after him?" Dongshan's eyes, tired but clear, held the young monk's gaze. "There, I do not see that he has any illness at all." The room fell quiet. Huiran, standing near the door, felt something shift in his understanding that he could not immediately name. His teacher had not hidden the illness. He had not performed wellness for the visiting monk's comfort, the way Huiran had spent the whole morning trying to arrange. He had simply been present, exactly as he was, breath-labored and body weak, while pointing calmly towards something in himself that the illness had never once touched. The young monk stood very still, his rehearsed question apparently already answered, though not in any form he could have anticipated on the long walk there. The young monk left some time later, quieter than he had arrived, bowing at the threshold with a depth that seemed to surprise even himself. He did not thank Dongshan for wisdom or comfort. He simply bowed and turned and walked back out into the cold, with something in his posture that had not been there 3 days earlier. Huiran remained by the bed afterward, sitting with his teacher in a silence that felt different from every silence he had managed on Dongshan's behalf before. A silence that asked nothing of him except to remain inside it. "I thought protecting you meant keeping people from seeing you struggle," Huiran finally said. "You were protecting yourself from watching me struggle," Dongshan said, not unkindly. "There is a difference, though I understand why 11 years made it hard to see. Being strong for someone, managing the room so they never have to witness anything difficult, is a kind of distance dressed up as devotion. Being present with someone means staying in the room exactly as it actually is, illness and all, without needing to arrange it into something easier to look at. I don't know if I know how to do that," Huiran admitted quietly. "Managing the room is the only kind of service I have ever fully trusted myself to give you. The one thing I arrived here already knowing how to do well." "You are doing it right now," Dongshan said, the faintest trace of a smile crossing his tired face. "You have not left. You have not offered me tea I do not want, or arranged my blankets for the 3rd time, or found some small task to busy your hands with. You are simply here. That is the entire practice. It was never more complicated than this." Huiran sat with this for a long while. The evening bell long since faded into silence. His teacher's labored breathing continuing steadily beside him. Above them both, the old beam held the roof exactly as it always had, through fevers and recoveries and the quiet passing of monks long before either of them had arrived at this monastery, never once needing the room beneath it to be arranged into something easier to witness. For the first time in 11 years, Huiran did not reach for anything to manage. He simply stayed and found, to his own quiet surprise, that staying required nothing of him at all except remaining exactly where he already was. The following morning, when another visiting monk arrived, asking to see the teacher, Huiran did not turn him away, and did not rehearse an excuse about retreats or schedules. He simply opened the door and let the visitor see exactly what was there: an old man breathing with difficulty, and an attendant sitting quietly beside him, neither of them pretending the room contained anything other than what it actually did. Huiran had confused two very different offerings strength performed on someone else's behalf, which requires hiding whatever might be uncomfortable to witness, and presence, which requires staying exactly where the discomfort actually is. Both can look, from a distance, like devotion. Only one of them actually keeps you in the room, and only one of them was ever actually available to the person who needed it. There, I do not see that he has any illness at all. Dongshan was not denying his own suffering, and he was certainly not performing wellness for the visiting monk's comfort. He was pointing to something underneath the illness that the illness had not reached, something Huiran's careful management had never once given anyone the chance to witness, because managing the room had always meant keeping the room from seeing anything real in the first place. You were protecting yourself from watching me struggle. That sentence deserves a long pause. So much of what looks like strength on another's behalf is actually distance, arranged carefully enough to be mistaken for care. Presence asks for something harder and simpler, staying exactly as things are, without needing to arrange them first, without needing the discomfort to resolve itself before you are willing to remain in the room with it. Perhaps you recognize this in your own life. Some person you love, whose difficulty you have spent years managing from the doorway, rather than sitting beside on the actual bed where the difficulty lives. Perhaps you have mistaken your own competence, your ability to handle things efficiently and well, for the deeper offering they actually needed from you, which was simply your willingness to stay and witness, without fixing anything at all, without needing the discomfort to end before you would agree to remain. If you have spent time managing the room around someone you love, arranging their difficulties into something easier to witness, let yourself notice, gently, whether that managing has quietly become a kind of distance. You do not have to perform steadiness for anyone tonight, not even in your own mind. You are allowed to simply be present with whatever is actually here, in this room, in this body, exactly as it is, without first needing to tidy it into something more presentable. Let your shoulders release the particular effort of managing anything at all right now. Let your breath move without needing to arrange itself into something calmer than it currently is. There is nothing to hide from yourself tonight, and no one here who needs protecting from the truth of how you actually feel, however unfinished or uncertain that truth happens to be this evening. You are doing it right now, simply by staying with these words instead of reaching for something to fix. That is the entire practice, and it was never more complicated than this. Let that be enough for tonight. This small, a complete act of remaining exactly where you already are. Somewhere else, in this long night, there is someone about to discover that leaving one small thing gently undone will not cause the whole world they have carefully built to fall apart. After all, the sick room quiets, and the night carries on toward its gentler hours, arriving now at a temple courtyard in Vietnam, centuries earlier, where a painter has just set down his brush in the middle of an unfinished scroll, certain that leaving it this way will undo everything he has spent his life building. 31 years of careful devotion suddenly narrowed down, in his own mind, to the one section he could not complete. There is a particular dread in imagining the one unfinished corner of something, the single loose thread, the sentence left half-spoken, as though it might unravel everything around it simply by existing. You picture the whole structure judged by its weakest, most incomplete point, rather than by everything that was actually finished with care. So you push past the moment your body or your time genuinely ran out, certain that stopping there would somehow be worse than continuing past every reasonable limit, because an unfinished thing feels, in the moment, indistinguishable from a failed one. This fear rarely announces itself honestly. It disguises itself as diligence, as high standards, as simply caring enough to see something through properly, all the way to its very last detail. But underneath, it is often a much older and more fragile belief that you will be judged, and perhaps judged fairly, by the one part of you that did not get to finish, rather than by the far larger part that did, quietly, without any fanfare at all. There is a teaching, plain and easily forgotten, that nothing conditioned was ever truly complete to begin with. That completion itself is a resting point. The mind invents, rather than a state, the world actually offers anyone, and that the fear of leaving something undone is often less about the thing itself than about what an unfinished ending might quietly say about the person who made it. Every painting, Every letter, every carefully built life eventually meets some honest edge, past which the maker simply had no more to give that day. The mind calls this failure. The world, more often than not, receives it quietly as simply the shape a finished enough thing happened to take. Long ago, in a temple in Lai Dynasty, Vietnam, an old painter discovered what actually happens when a scroll is left unfinished. After a lifetime spent certain, he already knew better. The temple bell reached the painting hall first. 3 slow strikes, calling the monks to evening chanting, fading into the humid air of early summer. Closer, the soft scratch of brush against silk, steady and practiced. A sound so familiar to the old painter that his hand moved almost without conscious thought. And nearest of all, the particular ache that had settled into the old painter's shoulder over the past several hours. An ache he had been quietly ignoring since midday, telling himself it was nothing more than the ordinary cost of a long day's work. His name was Thich Dao Hien, though the villagers simply called him Thay Hien, and he had painted the great processional scroll for the temple's summer festival for 31 consecutive years. A sweeping depiction of the Buddha's life stretched across nearly the full length of the painting hall, unrolled once a year for the festival, and rolled carefully away again until the following summer demanded a fresh one. He had trained under the temple's previous painter as a boy of 9, mixing pigments and stretching silk for a decade before he was ever trusted with a brush of his own, and had never, in all the years since that first trembling attempt, to allowed a single festival to pass without a scroll he considered fully complete. This particular year's scroll was to be his most ambitious yet, commissioned to mark the temple's 100th anniversary, and he had worked on it for 4 months without once missing a day, determined that the anniversary scroll would be remembered as the finest of his career, the one villagers would still speak of decades after he was gone. He was 72 years old now, and something in his chest had begun, in recent weeks, to protest the long hours bent over the silk in ways his younger body had never once done, a tightness he had attributed, each and every time, to simple fatigue and nothing more serious than that. The abbot had noticed his slowing pace weeks earlier and gently suggested an assistant, someone to handle at least the background details, while Thay Hien focused his remaining strength on the scroll's central figures, which Thay Hien had refused outright, certain that a scroll marking 100 years of the temple's history deserved a single unified hand, not the patchwork of 2 different painters' styles, however skilled the second hand might genuinely be. He had 2 days left before the festival, and 1 full section remaining, a depiction of the Buddha beneath the Bodhi tree that would complete the scroll's final panel, the panel he had privately considered, for months now, the piece that would ultimately define the entire work. He was midway through the leaves of the Bodhi tree, each one requiring careful, patient brushwork, the silk catching the late afternoon light in a way that had pleased him enormously only an hour earlier, when the ache in his chest sharpened suddenly into something he could not ignore, spreading down his left arm with an insistence that frightened him more than he wanted to admit. He set the brush down, his hand trembling badly enough to smear a small mark near the tree's lowest branch, and called weakly for help, his voice barely carrying beyond the painting hall's own walls. The temple physician came quickly, along with 2 young monks who half carried Thay Hien to a resting mat in the adjoining room. And though the physician's careful examination eventually confirmed the immediate danger had passed, a strain on an old heart, rather than the graver failure Thay Hien had briefly feared as the pain spread down his arm. The instruction that followed was unambiguous. delivered in the physician's gentlest but most unyielding voice. Complete rest. No brush. No silk. Nothing more for at least several weeks. Perhaps longer, depending on how the coming days unfolded. The scroll, Thầy Hiền said, his voice thin with something closer to grief than physical pain. It is unfinished. The festival is in 2 days. 31 years. And this is the one that will hang there incomplete. The abbot, an old friend of some 40 years, sat beside the resting mat and took Thầy Hiền hand. It will hang there exactly as it is, the abbot said. There is no version of this festival where you finish that section in your condition, and there is no version where I allow you to try. Then let someone else finish it. Anyone at all. I do not care whose hand it is, only that it not hang there half done for the whole village to see. There is no one who could match your work in 2 days without the difference showing plainly, the abbot said gently. You know this as well as I do, old friend. Then it will hang there ruined, Thầy Hiền said. Half a tree, half a Buddha's shade. People will see it and know I did not finish what I started. People will see it, the abbot agreed, and they will see 31 years of a devoted hand, and one summer where that hand, reached the honest edge of what it could give. I do not think that is ruin, old friend. I think it may be the truest thing your scroll has ever shown anyone. Thầy Hiền turned his face away, unconvinced, unable to meet his old friend's steady gaze with the particular shame he was carrying. He slept fitfully through the following 2 days, forbidden from even entering the painting hall, hearing only fragmented reports from the young monks about preparations continuing without him, each report arriving like a small fresh wound to a wound already tender. He rehearsed, in the dark, hours before dawn, on both nights, exactly what he would say to the assembled village when they saw the bare patch of silk, some version of an apology that never quite finished forming before sleep finally took him, always trailing off somewhere in the middle, unfinished in its own small way. On the morning of the festival, weak but insistent, he allowed himself to be carried in a chair to the edge of the courtyard to watch the scrolls unveiling, certain he was about to witness his own quiet disgrace unfold in front of the entire village. The accumulated respect of 31 years undone in a single unrolling. The scroll unrolled slowly across the hall's full length, generations of careful brushwork catching the morning light, villagers murmuring appreciatively at familiar scenes they had watched take shape across 4 long months, and reached, finally, the final panel, the Buddha beneath the Bodhi tree, its leaves rendered in exquisite, patient detail on every branch save one, where the silk remained bare, pale, entirely untouched. A single empty space among 10,000 painted leaves, exactly where his trembling hand had set down the brush 3 days earlier. The crowd fell quiet as they reached it. Thầy Hiền braced himself in his chair, his weakened heart beating uncomfortably fast, for murmurs, for disappointment, for the whispered judgment he had spent 2 sleepless nights rehearsing responses to in advance. Instead, an old woman near the front, a widow who had attended every festival for as long as anyone could remember, stepped closer to the bare patch of silk and said, loud enough for those nearby to hear, "Look, even the Buddha's shade lets the light through somewhere." A ripple of quiet agreement moved through the crowd. Someone else pointed out that the bare patch of silk, positioned exactly where morning sun struck the scroll each day of the festival, would catch the light in a way no painted leaf ever could. A small, accidental window of brightness inside the tree's canopy, growing brighter as the sun climbed. Children began asking to stand beneath that particular patch during the festival's blessing. Delighted by the warm spot of direct sun in a hall otherwise cool with shade, as though the unfinished leaf had become, without anyone deciding it should, the scroll's most beloved detail rather than its failure. Taehyun sat in his chair at the courtyard's edge, watching people gather beneath the one section he had been so certain would disgrace him, watching the abbot smile knowingly without saying a word, and felt something in his chest loosen that had nothing to do with his weakened heart at all. Taehyun had spent 31 years believing that his worth as a painter, and perhaps his worth entirely, depended on a scroll that never once showed the honest edge of what a single lifetime could give. Completion, in his mind, was not simply a nice outcome. It was the whole of the achievement, and anything short of it felt indistinguishable from failure. A private standard so absolute he had never once had the chance to discover it might not be shared by anyone else who looked at his work. Even the Buddha's shade lets the light through somewhere. Sit with that line for a moment. The unfinished leaf did not diminish 31 years of devoted work. It simply let something through that the finished version never could have. An honest window where the light was always going to find its way in, eventually, one way or another, whether Taehyun planned for it or not. Nothing conditioned was ever truly complete to begin with. Every scroll, every life, every carefully tended project eventually meets the honest edge of what its maker had left to give that particular season. The fear says this edge is a failure, proof of something lacking. The light, when it finally reaches that bare patch of silk, tends to disagree quietly, offering something the careful planning never could have arranged on its own. No matter how many more months Taehyun might have spent trying, perhaps you are carrying your own version of the bare patch of silk tonight. Some task or project or promise that did not get finished exactly the way you intended. Some section of your own life you have quietly decided disqualifies the rest of it from counting as whole. It is worth asking, gently, whether the world has actually judged that unfinished corner as harshly as you have, or whether, like the villagers gathered beneath the morning sun, it might be quietly finding its own use for the light coming through, in no hurry to call it anything other than exactly what it is. If there is something you have left undone tonight, some corner of your day or your life that did not get finished the way you had planned, let yourself set down the fear that this makes the whole of it a failure. You do not have to finish everything before you are allowed to rest. The parts you did complete remain exactly as real and as cared for as they always were, regardless of what still waits, unpainted, at the edges. Let your shoulders release the particular tension of reaching for one more unfinished task, one more email, one more small correction that could technically wait until morning. Let your breath settle into the parts of today that were, in fact, complete enough, more than enough, cared for with exactly the attention they deserved. Somewhere in whatever you left undone tonight, light may already be finding its own quiet way through. Whether you stay awake to watch it happen or not, whether anyone ever names it a gift or simply an accident of an honest, tired hand, the night is nearly done now. And so is the long walk through all these small knots of trying too hard to hold everything up alone. one careful story at a time. What remains is only the quiet after, the place where nothing more needs proving, and everything that was carried tonight is finally, gently, allowed to rest, unfinished corners and all, exactly as they are, in no need of a single additional stroke before sleep is permitted, at last, to arrive. The painter's scroll has long since been rolled away for the season, and the night has grown very late now, late enough that even the leaves have stopped needing to be swept, late enough that a house somewhere is finally, quietly, ready to sleep, its rooms dark, its fires banked low, everyone inside it already drifting or already gone. There is a particular stillness that arrives after a long night of carrying things, a stillness that does not ask you to understand anything more, does not ask you to resolve anything further, only to notice, gently, that your body is heavy in a good way now, heavy the way a house settles at the end of a long day, every board and beam finding its familiar place in the dark. It is not the heaviness of exhaustion exactly, though it may have started there hours ago. It is something quieter than that, the particular weight of a body that has finally stopped bracing against anything at all. Arms unclenched, jaw loose, the whole long effort of the evening finally allowed to set itself down. You do not have to do anything with this stillness. You do not have to understand it, or deepen it, or make sure it lasts. It is simply here, the way evening is simply here once the sun has gone, without anyone needing to arrange it or earn it, or hold it carefully in place. Nothing more needs saying, tonight, that has not already been said in some quieter form, somewhere earlier in this long night, in one shape or another. Only this, gathered up now into its simplest possible form. A life spent holding things does not have to end that way. Somewhere, an old house is about to prove it. One final time, without a single new word required. The forge fire had gone cold hours ago, banked down to nothing more than a faint orange memory beneath the ash, the way it did every night, now that the heavy work belonged to younger hands. Closer, the small settling creak of old timber cooling in the evening air, a sound the house had made every night for as long as anyone could remember, familiar as breathing. And nearest of all, the particular quiet of an old woman's breathing, slow and unhurried, sitting in the doorway of the house she had lived in for most of her life, watching the last color drain gently from the western sky. Her name was still May, though almost no one in the village called her that anymore, most simply saying, grandmother, the way the very old are often folded gently into a single shared name that carries all their years at once. She was 78 now, and the forge belonged to her grandson, who ran it with the same steady hands she remembered from her own youth, though his laughter carried further through the house than hers ever had. Her own hands, resting now in her lap, had grown soft and spotted with age, no longer capable of the work they had once done without complaint for so many decades, and she had made her peace with this slowly, over several quiet years, the way one makes peace with any season eventually ending. She had sat in this same doorway on countless quiet evenings across her long life, through the years when her own hands blistered and calloused at the anvil, through the years of raising Wei alone after his father's early death, through the slower, gentler years that had followed, when the forge no longer needed her daily hands and the house had filled, instead, with grandchildren's voices, small footsteps, and laughter that carried further than her own ever had. Tonight felt different from all of those evenings, though she could not immediately name why. Only that something in the house itself seemed to be settling into a stillness it had not quite reached before, a stillness that felt, somehow, complete. That afternoon, her son Wei had finally done something she had been quietly hoping for, without ever once asking for it aloud. In all the 2 winters, since she had first noticed the old beam beginning to sag ever so slightly lower each season. The old beam above the forge, the one that had held the roof since before she was born, since before her own mother was born, if the village records could be trusted, had been sagging visibly for those 2 winters. Its ancient wood settling almost imperceptibly lower each season, and Wei had spent the better part of the day setting a second post beneath it, a sturdy length of new timber wedged carefully into place beside the old one, sharing the weight the ancient beam had carried alone for so many decades without once being asked whether it wanted help. "You didn't have to do that today," May said, when he came to sit beside her in the doorway afterward, sawdust still clinging to his sleeves, the smell of fresh-cut wood mixing pleasantly with the cooling evening air drifting in from the garden. "It has been groaning for 2 winters, Mother," Wei said. "I did not want to wait for it to finally give out on its own, not after it has held so faithfully for so long." "It never once complained to me," May said, looking up at the old wood, dark with generations of smoke, its grain familiar to her as her own hands. "It didn't have to complain," Wei said. "I could see it needed help. It simply never occurred to it to ask, the way some things never quite learn how." May was quiet for a moment, something in her chest settling the way the beam itself must have settled that afternoon, finally allowed to lean a little of its weight onto something beside itself. "Sounds like an old woman I used to know," she said. Wei smiled, not needing to ask who she meant. He had heard, over the years, small pieces of a story about a rainy afternoon and a traveling monk, told and retold so many times that the details had softened into something closer to family legend than memory. The house held up fine either way. "All those years," he said. "It will hold up better now, with a little help." "I know," May said. "I am only glad I lived long enough to see it happen." The evening settled further around them as they sat together in comfortable silence, the sky deepening from orange to violet to the first true dark of the night, a single star appearing above the tree line, then another, then a scatter too numerous to count. Somewhere down the lane, a neighbor's dog barked once, briefly, at nothing in particular, and then fell silent again, settling back into its own evening rest. The whole village seemed to be settling into the same unhurried stillness, house by house, lamp by lamp, going dark, until only a scattered few windows still glowed faintly against the deepening blue. They sat together in the doorway as the evening deepened, the new post standing quietly beside the old beam, sharing without complaint a weight that had never actually required only one thing to carry it. Somewhere inside, her grandson's children were already asleep, the whole house breathing slowly around them, walls and roof, and the 2 supports overhead settling into the particular stillness that comes when something long carried alone finally has company. A cricket began its slow song somewhere near the garden wall. The last warmth of the day lifted gently off the stones beneath their feet, rising into the cooling air, and somewhere further off, The river that fed the village moved on toward the sea the way it always had, unhurried, needing nothing from either of them to keep flowing. May did not say much more that evening. She simply sat, watching the last light fade from the sky, feeling the cool evening air move through the doorway, listening to the small, ordinary sounds of a house at rest, the settle of timber, the distant murmur of her grandson's voice, somewhere inside, singing his own children towards sleep, the soft rustle of Wei beside her, no longer needing to hold anything up by herself, if she ever truly had. Above them, unseen in the dark, the old beam and the new post stood together, neither one straining, both simply present, doing together what one had spent a lifetime believing only it could do alone. The last of the daylight finally surrendered entirely to dusk, and somewhere beyond the doorway, the first cool breath of true night air moved gently through the village, carrying with it the smell of banked coals and turned earth and, faintly, the sweetness of some late-blooming flower May could no longer name but had always loved regardless. She thought, without any particular urgency, of all the evenings she had sat in this same doorway across all the years of her life, and found she did not mind, tonight, that this might be one of the last of them. There was nothing unfinished in the thought. It arrived, and she let it pass through her, the way the evening air passed through the doorway, without needing to hold on to it any more tightly than that. Wei rose eventually, pressing a hand briefly to his mother's shoulder before going inside to check on the children one last time, and May remained a while longer alone in the doorway, in no hurry to follow him in, watching the stars multiply overhead one by one until the whole dark bowl of the sky was scattered with them, more than she could ever hope to count in one sitting, each one simply present, asking nothing of the ones beside it, needing nothing from her at all except to be, for these few quiet minutes, simply and gently witnessed. There is nothing more to explain about the beam, or the post, or the old woman in the doorway. Only this something that held alone for a very long time was finally allowed to share the weight, and the roof did not fall. It simply settled, a little more evenly, into a rest it had been waiting for longer than anyone had thought to notice. There is nothing left to solve tonight. There is only the sound of old wood settling, the sound of a house breathing slowly around the people it holds, the sound of a river moving on toward the sea without needing anyone's permission to keep flowing. No more questions tonight, and no more answers needed either. No more knots to untangle, no more weight to weigh, no more stories left to tell before the telling itself can finally rest too. Only the doorway, and the dark, and the old beam, and the new post beside it, and the quiet, ordinary miracle of a roof that stays up simply because enough hands, across enough years, cared enough to keep it standing. One small act of care, layered patiently over another, until the whole structure simply held the way it always would. Let your own weight settle now, the way the house settled, the way the old beam finally leaned a little of itself onto something new beside it. You do not have to hold the roof by yourself tonight. You never entirely did. Let your breath come slow and unhurried, the way an old woman breathes in a doorway at the end of a long life of steady hands. Let your body grow heavy against whatever is holding you, trusting it the way wood learns, eventually, to trust the post beside it. Let your feet grow heavy. Let your hands, wherever they have settled, stop reaching for anything at all. Let your shoulders sink a little further into whatever is beneath them, an inch at a time, with no need to hurry any of it. Let your jaw soften. Let the small muscles around your eyes let go of whatever they have been holding since morning, since long before morning even, since whenever this particular weight first settled in. Let your whole body remember, the way old wood remembers, that it was never actually built to stand alone forever. That leaning, when the moment finally allows it, is not a failure of the thing that leans. Somewhere, very far from here now, a fire is banked low in a forge that no longer needs the hands that once tended it constantly. Somewhere, a river moves on toward a sea it has never once hurried to reach. Somewhere, a beam that held a roof alone for most of a century leans, finally, against something beside it, and neither one strains, and the roof stays exactly where it has always stayed. Somewhere, a boy who once swept a stone path finally let the leaves fall without him, unbothered. Somewhere, a merchant walked home from a mountain temple with nothing left to grip, his hands finally empty and easy at his sides. Somewhere, an attendant sat beside his teacher and discovered that staying, simply staying, was the whole of the practice. Nothing more complicated than that. All of it, every knot this long night carried, has led here, to this single quiet doorway, to this single settling breath, to this one house finally, fully, at rest. There is nothing left to carry tonight. There is only this stillness, this settling, this quiet house at the end of a long night, every board finding its place in the dark, every beam finally, gently, sharing its weight. The night has carried you this far. Let it carry you the rest of the way now, slow breath by slow breath, needing nothing further from you at all. The stars are still out there, uncounted, over every doorway in every village this long night has visited, over every forge and temple and frozen pond and quiet river this night has carried you gently through. They do not need tending. They simply are, the way you, too, in this last quiet stretch before sleep, are simply allowed to be, without one more thing to prove, without one more weight to hold, without one more door left to close, before rest is finally, fully, permitted to arrive. Rest now. You have already done enough. You were always allowed to. There is a beam above an old house, are still standing, still holding what it holds. Only now, it leans a little of its weight onto a second post beside it, and the roof has never once fallen, and it never will. Not because the beam grew stronger, but because it was finally allowed to share. Tonight carried you through Chan monasteries in old China, through a Zen hall above a frozen pond in Japan, through a forest temple in Thailand where a bell would not stop ringing, through a painter's quiet courtyard in Vietnam. 10 small knots, loosened one at a time, by hands that were never as alone as they believed themselves to be. You were never only the strong one. You were never only the one who holds. Whatever you carried tonight, the tiredness you hid, the grief you postponed, the grip you were afraid to loosen, none of it disqualifies you from rest. You are allowed to set it down. You are allowed to be tired. You are allowed to be held instead of holding, just for tonight, just for as long as sleep needs you. You were never only the strong one. You were always simply enough. Let this be the night you stop checking whether everyone else is all right before checking on yourself. Let the roof hold itself for a few hours. Let your breath grow slow and unwatched, the way breath does when no one is asking anything of it. And let sleep simply arrive, uninvited, the way rest always eventually does. I want to say, honestly, one more time, before I let you go, I do not have this figured out either. I am still learning how to set things down myself. If tonight helped even slightly, that is enough for both of us. Tomorrow will ask things of you again, the way tomorrows always do. But it does not need your answer tonight. Let tomorrow wait quietly at the edge of the room until morning actually arrives. And let tonight belong completely to rest, to breath, to nothing more than this. If tonight's stories found you when you needed them, let this be the place you return to the next time carrying feels heavier than resting. We will be here. Sleep now, without holding anything up. The beam is steady. The roof is quiet. The house is dark and warm and asking nothing of you at all. Rest, exactly as you are, exactly where you are, for as long as the night is willing to hold you.